Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley, the place where stories linger long after the lights go out. Tonight, we prepared chilling tales paired with the soothing sound of rain to ignite your imagination and make your heart race. If you feel the cold creeping in, tap that like button. It helps keep the shadows alive. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from or share the scariest moment that sent shivers down your spine. Don't forget to subscribe. You wouldn't want to miss what lurks in the darkness ahead. It started with a question. A small, fleeting thought that crept into my mind one quiet evening. What if the mirrors in our house aren't reflecting the truth? I didn't think much of it at first. Just another odd, passing thought, like one of those questions you ask yourself when you're bored, tired, or perhaps a little too caught up in your own head. But the thought lingered, and soon it began to make sense in a way that made me feel uneasy. My apartment was normal. A modest, quiet place. The kind of home that doesn't stand out but feels comfortable enough to get lost in. I had a few mirrors scattered around, each one placed with care. The full-length mirror by the door, the small one in the hallway, and the larger one in the living room, all reflecting my life, or so I thought. At first, nothing seemed wrong. But then, I began noticing little things. Small shifts in reflection that I couldn't explain. Like how the room behind me would look different from the way I remembered it just a moment ago. It was subtle at first. A slight difference in the arrangement of furniture. A shadow that didn't belong. The kind of thing you might dismiss as a trick of the light or your imagination playing games. But there was something about these oddities that didn't sit right with me. I would stand in front of the hallway mirror, adjusting my clothes, only to notice that the room behind me wasn't quite how I remembered it. A chair, for instance, would be in a different place. Or a picture frame that I could swear was on the left wall would be on the right in the reflection. I even began to see things in the reflection that I knew weren't there. Objects I didn't own. A dark shape in the corner that would disappear when I turned around. But when I checked, nothing was there. Then, one evening, things escalated. I was in the living room, preparing dinner. I glanced up at the large mirror across from me, as I often did when I moved around the space. But this time, the reflection wasn't mine. It was someone else. A man, standing where I should have been, staring back at me from the mirror. His face was blurry, like I could almost make out his features, but couldn't. His expression was unsettling, as though he was both aware of me and indifferent to my presence. I froze, my hand still gripping the knife I had been using to chop vegetables. I quickly turned, expecting to see him behind me, but there was nothing. Just the empty room. I looked back at the mirror, and the man was still there. Only now, he was standing closer, his face clearer. He wore a suit, but the colors were off, faded, like something out of an old photograph. His eyes, hollow, almost black, stared at me, and I felt something deep in my gut twist. It was a sensation I couldn't explain. A coldness that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. I moved to the side of the mirror to see if the reflection would follow me. It did. The man in the mirror stayed where he was, frozen, as if he were watching me, waiting. I could hear the sound of my heartbeat pounding in my ears, and the floor beneath my feet seemed to hum with an unnatural vibration. I pulled away from the mirror, my breath shallow. The air around me felt heavy, like something was pressing down on me. I stared at the glass, expecting it to crack, expecting the man to step out, but nothing happened. The reflection went back to being mine. Just me. No man. No presence. I was left there, in that moment, alone with my thoughts. The quiet hum of the refrigerator was the only sound filling the space. The kind of silence that is not comforting, but unsettling. A silence that makes you wonder what's hiding in the corners, just beyond your sight. But that was just the beginning. The first sign of something darker. Something that wasn't just in the mirror, but in the very air around me. I couldn't stop thinking about the reflection. It felt wrong. The more I thought about it, the more I started to question everything. Were the mirrors showing me a glimpse into another reality? Or were they simply reflecting my mind, a mind on the edge of something I couldn't fully understand? I needed to know. And as I stood there, staring at my reflection, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was waiting, watching. And the worst part? I wasn't sure if it was real, or if I was just losing my mind. The days that followed were a blur. I found myself avoiding mirrors as much as I could, but that only made the paranoia worse. It felt like the more I tried to ignore the strange reflections, the more persistent they became. I began to see things even when I wasn't looking directly at them. Out of the corner of my eye, a shadow would move in the hallway mirror, or I'd catch a glimpse of something in the bathroom mirror, a flicker of motion, something that shouldn't have been there. It was like the mirrors were trying to show me something, but I wasn't sure if I was ready to see it. I kept telling myself I was just tired, or that it was the stress of work, or maybe even a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew it was something else. One night, I decided to face it. I needed to know what was happening, to see it with my own eyes, even if it scared me. I stood in front of the living room mirror again, willing myself to look straight into the reflection. I waited for the sensation, the coldness, the feeling that something was there that shouldn't be. But it didn't come. For a moment, I almost thought I had imagined everything. Perhaps the man in the mirror was nothing more than a figment of my overactive imagination. I breathed out in relief, stepping back from the glass. And that's when I saw it. The reflection didn't move with me. Instead of mimicking my steps, it remained frozen, its face still and expressionless. It was like the reflection was holding its breath, waiting for something. I took another step, and this time I couldn't ignore it. The air around me seemed to distort slightly, like heat rising off a pavement. The edges of the mirror flickered, and I heard a faint rustling, almost like paper being crumpled. My heart started to race again. I didn't dare look away from the mirror, afraid of what might happen if I did. Then, a sound echoed from behind me, faint at first, but growing louder. Shuffling footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. But when I turned around, the room was empty. No one was there. I went back to the mirror, and this time, the reflection had changed. The man was no longer standing still. He was walking towards me. Slowly, deliberately, his face growing clearer with each step. His eyes locked with mine, dark and unblinking. I couldn't breathe. I stepped back from the mirror, my feet stumbling, but the reflection moved with me. He was getting closer, each movement synchronized with mine. My body went cold as I felt the pressure of something unseen closing in on me. I ran. I bolted for the door, but the moment I turned my back to the mirror, the sound of the footsteps followed me. It was impossible to ignore now, the unmistakable sound of someone or something walking behind me. I slammed the door shut, my breathing erratic. I leaned against it, my hands trembling. The footsteps stopped. Silence. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in that mirror was still there, watching. That night, sleep came fitfully. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the man from the mirror, his face so vivid and terrifying that I couldn't escape him even in my dreams. The worst part was the feeling that I wasn't just dreaming, that whatever was on the other side of the mirror was trying to make its way into my world. I woke up the next morning to find the apartment exactly as I had left it, but something felt off. Like the space around me had changed, shifted in subtle ways. The air felt thicker, heavier. And the mirrors. They were no longer just reflections of my world, they felt like windows into something else. Something that I wasn't ready to understand. I couldn't keep avoiding them forever. And so, with a nervous breath, I walked into the bathroom and stared into the mirror, waiting for something to happen. The air seemed to hum with electricity, and I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. For a split second, I thought I saw something move behind me in the reflection. A dark shape, just at the edge of my vision. I spun around quickly, but there was nothing. No shadow, no presence. Just the empty bathroom. I turned back to the mirror. And then I saw it. The reflection of myself, or rather, something that looked like me, was smiling. A wide, unnaturally stretched grin. It wasn't my smile. It was wrong. I gasped, stepping back, but the reflection remained frozen, locked in that eerie smile. My own face. But not my own. And that's when I realized the worst part. The worst part wasn't the man in the living room mirror. It wasn't the strange occurrences or the sounds that filled the space around me. The worst part was that the reflection was not just showing me things from another reality. It was showing me things I didn't want to see. Things about myself that were locked deep inside. And the more I looked, the more I began to wonder, was I looking at a mirror, or was the reflection looking at me? I couldn't stop looking at it. The reflection, my reflection, smiled wider, its mouth stretching unnaturally, as if it was mocking me. My heart pounded in my chest, and my breath caught in my throat. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to move. I stood frozen in front of the mirror, unable to tear my eyes away from the distorted version of myself. And then, it did something even worse. The smile began to fade, and in its place, the reflection of me stepped forward. It took a step, just one, as if it were about to step out of the glass and into my world. I stumbled back, my pulse quickening. I could feel the air around me change, thick and suffocating, like the room itself was holding its breath. I took a step away from the mirror, but so did the reflection. It moved with me. I rushed to the side, desperate to break the connection, but it followed. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, like it didn't belong in the same space as I did. The longer I stared, the more I felt like it was alive, not just a reflection. I turned and bolted out of the bathroom, my feet unsteady beneath me. The sound of my breathing filled my ears, but underneath it, I could still hear the faint echo of something else, the creaking of the mirror, the soft scraping sound of something shifting, moving. I ran through the apartment, desperate to escape whatever was starting to crawl out of the glass. It was in the living room that I stopped, frozen in my tracks. The mirror there was the largest in the apartment. Its smooth surface had always been a source of comfort, a thing I took for granted. But now, it was different. I could see it warping, the edges rippling like water disturbed by an unseen force. It's not real, I told myself, my hand shaking as I gripped the doorframe. It's just a trick of the mind. But then, I saw it again. The reflection. This time, it wasn't just a man in a suit or a blurred face. It was me. My exact likeness, standing in the mirror. But the eyes. They were different. Dark. Hollow. Lifeless. The reflection tilted its head just slightly, as though studying me. And then it smiled, not the grotesque grin from before, but something far worse, a knowing, taunting smile, as though it knew something I didn't. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I took a step forward, my legs heavy, and my fingers tingling with the sensation of dread. The reflection's smile grew wider. It tilted its head further, mimicking my movements exactly, but with an eerie slowness. I felt my pulse quicken, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. "It's not real," I whispered under my breath, but the words felt hollow. Suddenly, the reflection stopped moving. Its eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment there was an unbearable silence. It felt like the world had paused, as if the room itself was holding its breath. I stepped back from the mirror, but when I did, the reflection didn't follow. It stayed exactly where it was, staring at me with that unsettling, knowing look. But now, the room behind it was different. The furniture had shifted. The shadows were wrong. The walls seemed to be closing in. The reflection wasn't just a mirror image anymore, it was showing something else. Something wrong. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to run, but I couldn't tear myself away. The reflection was pulling me in, drawing me closer, as if it were a doorway, a portal to something that wasn't real, but that felt all too real. My breathing grew shallow, and I stumbled backward, my foot catching on the edge of the rug. I fell, hitting the ground with a thud. The sound of it echoed in the empty space, but even as I lay there, I could hear the soft footsteps from the mirror. Soft, slow, deliberate. The footsteps began to grow louder, as though they were walking toward me. I scrambled to my feet, panic flooding my chest. But when I turned, I found the mirror, still. Silent. The reflection was gone. I didn't understand. I had seen it. I had heard it. The footsteps, the shifting shadows, the distorted version of myself. But now, the mirror was calm. Too calm. I turned away, breathless, my heart pounding in my chest. But then, as I reached for the door, the sound came again. Faint at first, but undeniable. A slow, heavy footstep from behind. The kind that made your skin crawl. I turned, but there was nothing. Just the empty room. I took a shaky breath, telling myself it was nothing. But the feeling lingered. Something was here. Something was watching. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was on the other side of the mirror was not just watching me, it was waiting. Waiting for me to make the next move. It was impossible to stay still. I couldn't shake the feeling that the mirror, and whatever was beyond it, was pulling me deeper into something I couldn't control. I had to get out of this apartment, out of this space where the walls seemed to close in and the reflections were becoming more real than anything else. I paced back and forth, running my hands through my hair, trying to make sense of it all. I told myself to calm down, that I was just imagining things, that maybe I needed to sleep, to rest. But the noise, the footsteps, the creaking, followed me. Every time I turned my back, it was there, just at the edge of my senses. That cold, insistent presence. I moved to the window and looked out at the dark street below. The city was quiet, too quiet. No one on the sidewalks. No cars passing by. Just the dull hum of the lights in the distance. For a brief moment, I wondered if this was it, if the whole world had stopped while I was trapped in this apartment, in this nightmare. I need to leave, I thought, grabbing my jacket off the couch. Just get out of here. Get away from the mirrors. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway, but the moment I did, I heard it again. The footsteps. They weren't in the apartment anymore. They were in the hallway, just outside the door. They echoed, slow and deliberate, with the same unnerving rhythm that had followed me before. I froze. My heart stopped. The noise wasn't just behind me. It was coming from every direction. I turned toward the hallway, the shadows stretching long and thin along the walls. The light in the corridor flickered once, then twice, before it went out completely, leaving me in complete darkness. I stood frozen, my hands trembling. I could hear my own breath, shallow and panicked, but the footsteps, they kept coming. Closer. Suddenly, a cold breeze rushed through the hallway, and I heard a faint voice. Barely a whisper. Come back. I spun around, my back pressed against the door. The voice was familiar. My voice. I didn't understand. How could it be? I hadn't spoken, not a word. But I knew that voice. It was mine. Come back, the whisper came again, this time clearer, louder. And then, the unmistakable sound of a door opening. I wanted to scream, but nothing came out. My body refused to move. I couldn't look away from the darkness ahead of me, where I knew something waited. The footsteps stopped, but the whispering continued, soft and insistent, like it was pulling me, beckoning me to step into the dark. I ran. I ran as fast as I could, slamming the door shut behind me. I didn't care where I went anymore. I just had to get away from it. I raced down the stairs of the building, out into the street, not stopping, not looking back. The cold air cut through me, but I didn't feel it. I was too numb. When I finally stopped, gasping for breath, I realized I had no idea where I was. I looked around. The streets were unfamiliar. The buildings were tall and looming, but they felt wrong. Like they were part of something I didn't recognize. Something that wasn't supposed to be here. I stumbled forward, unsure of where I was going. The world around me felt too quiet. Too still. Like I had stepped into a place that didn't belong. The sidewalks were empty, the streets barren. The entire city seemed to be holding its breath. That's why I saw it. The reflection. A mirror, standing upright against the wall of a nearby building. I hadn't noticed it before. It wasn't there a second ago, I was sure of it. But now, it stood there, perfectly still, just like the ones in my apartment. The glass was dark, too dark, like it had absorbed all the light around it. And in the reflection, I saw myself. But not just me. Me and someone else. The man from the living room mirror, standing beside me, his eyes fixed on mine. And then, as if in slow motion, he reached out a hand. I gasped and stepped back, but the reflection didn't move. It didn't have to. It was as though the mirror had pulled me in, trapping me between two worlds, one that felt wrong and another that was slipping away. I turned to run again, but my legs felt heavy, like they were dragging through the air. The streets were closing in around me, the buildings growing taller, and the sounds of footsteps echoed from every direction. There was no escaping it. The mirror was still there, staring back at me, the reflection of the man standing at the edge, waiting. It wasn't a portal. It wasn't another reality. It was something deeper, something I hadn't understood until now. The mirrors weren't just showing me a different world, they were showing me pieces of myself. Pieces that I hadn't wanted to see, things that I had buried deep inside. The reflection wasn't just some other person. It was me, and it was pulling me in. I could feel it. The pull was getting stronger. It was as though the reflection was no longer trapped inside the glass. It was reaching through, pulling me in. I closed my eyes, trying to escape the sensation, but when I opened them again, the mirror was gone, and I was standing in front of my apartment door. The door. I was standing right in front of it, but how? How had I ended up here? My mind raced, my body shaking as if I were still caught in the grip of a nightmare, but the world around me felt too real, too suffocating. The street was gone. The strange, looming buildings, the reflections, it was all gone. The sounds, the whispers, the footsteps, none of it was here anymore. Just the door. I reached out, my hand trembling, and placed it on the cold brass handle. I was afraid to open it. Afraid of what waited inside. The mirrors. The voices. The thing that had been chasing me. But I couldn't stand in the hallway forever. I had to face it. I had to confront whatever was behind that door, or whatever had been pulling me into the mirror. I twisted the handle. The door opened with a creak, and I stepped inside. The apartment was silent. Too silent. The same apartment I had left hours ago, or was it days? Time felt warped, twisted. The air was still, heavy, and the familiar space seemed off. The shadows stretched too long, the corners of the room too dark. I could feel something watching me, like I wasn't alone. I turned and froze. There, standing at the far end of the living room, was the mirror. The large one that had always been a part of the apartment. But this time, it wasn't just reflecting the room. It was reflecting me. And I was standing there, too. But the version of me in the mirror wasn't like the others I had seen. It wasn't a distorted version or a figure from another world. No, this reflection looked exactly like me. But something was off. The eyes. They weren't right. The stare was vacant. Empty. Like it wasn't me looking back. My pulse quickened as I stepped forward. The reflection mimicked my movements, but its expression remained unchanged. That same dead, hollow stare. I reached out instinctively, and so did the reflection. But this time, it didn't just mirror my actions, it seemed to wait, as if it were expecting me to make the first move. I wanted to scream, but the sound wouldn't come. I couldn't move. I was trapped in that gaze, my feet rooted to the floor. Then, something shifted. The reflection in the mirror smiled. The same unnerving, grotesque smile I had seen before. But this time, it was different. It wasn't mocking. It wasn't taunting. It was familiar. It was my smile. Or what I had once believed to be my smile. And suddenly, everything clicked. I wasn't just trapped in a mirror. I wasn't just facing something from another world. What I had been running from wasn't some external force. It had always been a part of me. The fear, the isolation, the whispers, they were reflections of my own mind. My own psyche, fractured and torn apart by everything I had been avoiding, all the parts of myself I had pushed down and ignored. I had been running from myself. The reflection in the mirror stepped forward, moving with an unnatural slowness, its eyes still locked on mine. I could feel the pull, the desire to give in, to let it take me, to step into that reflection and finally become whole again. But I couldn't. Not this time. I tore my eyes away from the mirror, pushing past the fear that gripped me. I had to fight it. I had to face it head on. The mirror was not a portal to another reality. It was not a doorway to some dark dimension. It was a mirror that reflected my innermost fears. I grabbed the edge of the mirror, my hand shaking as I pulled it off the wall, feeling the weight of it in my grip. It was cold. Too cold. I could feel the coldness seep through my fingers, through my skin, but I didn't stop. I kept pulling until it fell to the floor with a loud crash, shattering into 1,000 pieces. The sound of glass shattering echoed through the apartment, and for a moment, everything was silent. The air felt lighter. The pressure, the pull, the fear, it all lifted. I wasn't trapped anymore. The reflection was gone. I was free. But as I stood there, staring at the broken pieces of the mirror scattered across the floor, I knew something had changed. Something inside me. I had faced the darkness, but it hadn't just disappeared. It had become a part of me. A part one could never forget. I glanced down at the shards of glass, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw something, a flicker of movement in the broken reflections. But this time, I wasn't afraid. Because now, I knew the truth. The mirror didn't just show me what was on the other side. It showed me who I really was. And no matter how broken, no matter how shattered, I would have to live with that reflection for the rest of my life. It started with a phone call. I had just finished dinner and was sitting on the couch, flicking through a random show on the TV. The room was quiet, the only sound coming from the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. The evening had felt normal, too normal. That's probably what made it so unsettling when the phone rang. I wasn't expecting any calls. It was late, almost 10, and most people I knew better than to call at this hour. I glanced at the screen. A hidden number. At first, I debated not answering. But for some reason, my hand reached for the phone. I picked it up, bringing it to my ear. "Hello?" I said, my voice hoarse from the silence. The line was filled with static at first, but then a voice came through, calm, clear, but also strange. "It's me," the voice said, and I froze. I didn't recognize the voice, but there was something about it that sent a chill up my spine. It sounded familiar, in a way I couldn't place. "Who is this?" "It's you," the voice continued. "Or it was you. From another time." My heart skipped a beat. The voice sounded like mine, but somehow off. I couldn't explain it, but it was as if I were hearing myself from a distance, a version of me from somewhere I didn't recognize. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "What are you talking about?" "You need to listen carefully," the voice said, and I could hear a sense of urgency, of panic, creeping into the words. "Something is going to happen, and it's going to be bad. You have to be careful. Don't ignore it. Don't let it happen." My pulse quickened, and I glanced around the room as if expecting someone to be standing behind me. "What's going to happen? Who are you? How do you know me?" "I'm you," the voice repeated, but this time there was an edge to it. "Or I was. You need to believe me. The phone call you're getting now is the last chance you have to stop it. If you don't do something." There was a sudden burst of static, then a long silence. My thoughts raced, my mind scrambling to make sense of what I was hearing. How was this possible? A call from the future? It sounded ridiculous, like something out of a movie. Stop what? I asked, feeling a growing sense of dread, my palms starting to sweat. What are you talking about? But the voice didn't answer. Instead, there was a soft, shuffling noise. Like footsteps. Footsteps that were coming from the other side of the line. The noise grew louder, closer. And then, the voice spoke again. You need to. Suddenly, the line went dead. I sat there in stunned silence, the phone pressed to my ear, trying to make sense of it all. My breath came in shallow gasps, my hands trembling. The world around me felt different, as if the very air had shifted, turned heavier. Had I imagined it? Had I really just heard that? I slowly pulled the phone away from my ear, staring at it in disbelief. My mind was racing. A call from the future? A warning about something I was supposed to stop? I shook my head. It didn't make sense. But as I stood up and paced the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. That somehow, something had already started. The phone call had left me with a lingering sense of unease. It was as if something terrible was waiting just beyond the horizon, and I had been given a glimpse of it. I couldn't explain it, but deep down, I knew I had to do something. I had to figure out what was happening or face the consequences. But where do I even begin? The thought echoed in my mind, unanswered. Then, just as I was about to sit back down, the phone rang again. Another hidden number. This time, I didn't hesitate. I answered, my voice shaking. Hello? The line was silent for a long moment before a voice came through, just as strange and unsettling as before. It's happening, the voice said. And I knew, somehow, that I couldn't ignore it any longer. The phone call had barely ended when I felt the air grow colder, a shiver crawling down my spine. I stood frozen, holding the phone, staring at the screen. The voice from before had sounded too real. Too close. I put the phone down on the table, my mind spinning. The room around me felt like it was pressing in, the walls closer than usual, the shadows stretching unnaturally long. My eyes darted to the window, but the familiar sight of the dark street outside brought no comfort. I paced the room, each step feeling heavier than the last, my heart pounding in my chest. It's happening, the voice had said. But what did that even mean? The more I thought about it, the more the words seemed to echo in my head. It's happening. The phrase didn't leave me. The warning. I didn't know what I was supposed to do with it. The voice, the strange static, and the urgency, it all felt too real. Too vivid. The room, once so comfortable, now felt alien. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of a car passing outside, but there was something else. A soft sound, like a tapping at the window. I froze. I didn't move. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate. At first, I thought it was a tree branch brushing against the glass, but when I took a step toward the window, I realized the sound wasn't coming from outside. It was from within the room. From the walls themselves. I backed away, my breath catching in my throat. What the hell was that? The tapping stopped as suddenly as it had started. The silence felt suffocating. I stood in the middle of the room, waiting, listening. The air seemed heavier now, thicker. I felt like I was waiting for something to happen. Waiting for the next sign. And then, the phone rang again. This time, I didn't even check the screen. I just grabbed it, pressing it to my ear. Hello? The voice was there again, steady and calm, like it had never left. It's me. You're not listening. You have to understand, this is your only chance. I closed my eyes, the weight of the voice pressing down on me. What do you mean? What chance? Who is this? I told you, I'm you. But from a different time. A different version of you. I've seen what happens if you don't act. If you don't listen, it will be too late. My head spun. What do I have to do? Don't ignore the small things. The sounds. The signs. It will start small, almost unnoticeable, but it will grow. It's already started. There's something in the house with you. You need to leave. Now. Don't wait. I glanced around the room, my heart rate picking up again. Something in the house with me? The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Was this real? Was this just some sick joke? Or was it possible that I was really hearing myself, some version of myself, from another time? Where do I go? I asked, my voice trembling. What should I do? But the voice didn't respond. Instead, there was a deep, unnatural crackling sound, like static filling the line. The connection began to distort, the voice becoming harder to hear. Then, it cut out completely. I stood there, still holding the phone, my hand shaking. Leave? But where could I go? And what was I even running from? The house felt quiet again, almost too quiet, but I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. That something was watching me. That something was waiting. I couldn't stay here any longer. Not with the feeling that whatever was in the house had only just begun. I quickly grabbed my coat and headed for the door. My mind was racing, but every step I took, I felt that same heaviness, that sense of being followed. I stepped outside into the cold night air, the streets empty and silent. But even with the world so still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That I wasn't alone. The phone call was no longer a vague warning. It felt like a message I should have listened to sooner. But it was too late for that now. As I walked down the street, the sounds of my footsteps seemed too loud. Too real. The streetlights above flickered once, then twice, casting long shadows across the pavement. I glanced over my shoulder. Nothing. Just empty streets. But then, I heard it. A faint noise, coming from behind me. A soft tapping. I turned, but there was nothing there. Only the street, quiet and still. I could feel the presence again, though. A presence just out of sight. Something following me, something that shouldn't be there. I broke into a run, my breath coming in short gasps, my footsteps echoing louder in the empty street. And then, in the distance, I saw it. A figure. Standing in the shadows. I couldn't make out the details. But I could feel its gaze on me, heavy and unrelenting. The tapping sound was getting louder, and I knew, somehow, that it was getting closer. I had to get away. But no matter how fast I ran, no matter how far I tried to go, I felt the pull of that voice, the warning ringing in my ears. It was already too late. My legs burned as I sprinted down the deserted street, but it wasn't the physical exhaustion that was eating at me. It was the feeling that I was being hunted. That something was closing in, silently, just out of reach, but never too far behind. I glanced over my shoulder again, but the figure was gone. The street, still empty. Still silent. but I couldn't shake the unease. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the voice, of the warnings. Don't ignore the small things, it had said. The sounds, the signs, the tapping. I stopped for a moment, breathless, my heart pounding in my chest. The streetlights flickered again. I looked up at them, my pulse quickening. There's something wrong with this place. With this night. The figure I'd seen earlier was gone, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized it had never truly left. The air felt thick with it, like the shadows themselves were alive, crawling along the ground just beneath my feet. I couldn't stay here, not with the night closing in around me, not with that presence lingering in every corner of my mind. I had to get away. Get as far from the house as possible. I forced myself to keep moving, my eyes scanning every shadow, every darkened corner of the street. The tapping sound, slow, rhythmic, deliberate, began again, but this time it wasn't just behind me. It was all around me. No, this isn't real. I'm losing my mind. I kept telling myself that over and over, but the tapping didn't stop. It grew louder until it wasn't just tapping anymore. It was footsteps, heavy, dragging, like something where someone was stalking me, moving closer with every beat of my heart. I broke into a run again, my chest tightening as the noise closed in. I didn't dare look back, but the fear clawed at me, the panic rising up my throat. I need to get away. I need to get to safety. I wasn't sure where I was going anymore. My feet carried me blindly, the streets stretching on endlessly, the shadows growing longer with every step. And then I saw it. At the end of the street, a darkened alleyway that hadn't been there before. I didn't remember it, but I couldn't think about that now. I could see the faint glow of a street lamp at the end of the alley, and something, a glimmer of hope, maybe urged me to go toward it. Maybe there was a way out. The footsteps behind me grew louder. Closer. I turned into the alley, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The tapping stopped for a moment, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to look over my shoulder. Nothing. Just the empty street behind me. I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. I reached the end of the alley, only to find the street beyond it completely dark. No lights. No sign of life. Just blackness, stretching out into the unknown. And then I heard it again. The tapping. But this time, it wasn't coming from behind me. It was coming from ahead. I froze. The voice from earlier echoed in my mind again. There's something in the house with you. You need to leave. Now. My heart raced as I stepped forward cautiously, trying to make sense of the sound. The closer I got to the end of the alley, the louder the tapping became. It wasn't the same as before, though. This was something different, something deeper, more ominous. And then I saw it. At the very end of the alley, a figure stood, its back to me. The shape of it was faint in the darkness, but the way it stood, rigid and unmoving, made my blood run cold. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were made of stone, and the sound of the tapping grew louder, faster. The figure didn't turn around. It just stood there, frozen, as if it was waiting for me. My breath hitched in my throat. What is it? Who is it? I took a step forward, then another, unable to tear my eyes away from the figure. Then, something changed. The figure shifted. It turned, slowly, its head tilting at an unnatural angle. The movement was jerky, like a broken puppet, and I felt an icy chill crawl down my spine. The face was familiar. Too familiar. It was me. But not me. The eyes, wide, glassy, unblinking, stared back at me. The expression on its face was blank, hollow, as if it was nothing more than a reflection of what I used to be. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't obey. I was frozen in place, my heart hammering in my chest. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure disappeared into the shadows, leaving only the sound of the tapping behind. I was alone. But I didn't feel alone. I felt watched. I stumbled backward, my mind racing, the fear threatening to swallow me whole. I needed to leave. I needed to get out of here. But no matter which direction I turned, the tapping followed. It was no longer just a sound. It was a presence, moving with me, closing in on me. And I realized, with a sickening certainty, that the warning from the phone call wasn't just about a threat. It was a warning of something far worse, something that had already started. The tapping was no longer just a sound. It was them. I bolted forward, the air thick with fear, my legs moving faster than my mind could process. The tapping was everywhere now, all around me, beneath my feet, in the very walls of the alley itself. It felt like the world was closing in, the shadows growing darker with each step I took, pulling me deeper into the unknown. I didn't know where I was going anymore. The alley seemed to stretch on forever, and yet, no matter how fast I ran, the tapping followed me, relentless and deafening. It was like a pulse, a heartbeat, not mine, but something else's, something alive. And it was closing in on me, just waiting for me to make a mistake, waiting for me to falter. I turned a corner, desperate for some kind of escape, but the street in front of me was just as empty as the alley had been. Dark. Silent. The only sound was the relentless tapping, now so loud it felt as if it was coming from inside my head. My breath came in ragged gasps. My heart was pounding in my ears. I pressed my hand against the side of a building, trying to steady myself, but the world around me felt like it was shifting, warping. The shadows twisted, bending unnaturally, as if they had a life of their own. And then I saw it. In the reflection of a shop window, I saw myself. But I wasn't standing there, not like I thought I was. The reflection showed me, but distorted. Twisted. The face that stared back at me was pale, gaunt, its eyes wide and vacant. It was like looking at a version of myself that had been drained of all life. The figure in the glass was twitching, jerking with unnatural movements. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the city around me. The tapping continued, louder now, more frantic. I turned away from the reflection, unable to look at it any longer, but even as I turned, the face in the window remained. It didn't move with me. It just watched. I backed away from the glass, my mind unraveling, the fear making it hard to think. Every instinct told me to run, to get away from whatever this was, but I couldn't escape it. The tapping was everywhere, the sound so close it felt like something was breathing down my neck. And then, the voice came again. "You're too late," it said, soft but clear, as if it was standing right beside me. My voice. My own voice. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest, but there was nothing there. No one. Just empty streets, the shadows, the tapping. "What do you want from me?" I whispered, my voice shaking. "There's nothing you can do. It's already begun." The voice was distant now, almost lost in the static. The future is already set. You can't change it. You have to accept it. The future? I didn't understand. How could this be happening? How could this be me? I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was no use. The tapping was in my head now, racing through my thoughts. And then I felt it. A cold, clammy hand brushing against my arm. I whipped around, but again, no one was there. But the touch, it lingered. The sensation of something wrong. I stumbled back, my mind reeling, my heart pounding in my chest. The shadows shifted again, pulling themselves closer to me. The streetlights flickered and then went out, plunging everything into total darkness. The tapping stopped. For a moment, there was nothing. Just the oppressive silence. And then, in the blackness, I heard it, a whisper. A breath, too close. It's here. I turned toward the sound, my body frozen with terror. My breath was shallow, my chest tight. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. In the darkness, I could feel something watching me. Something close. Something that wasn't human. I could hear it now, the faint sound of movement, slow, deliberate, like footsteps in the dark. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure emerged from the shadows, tall and thin, its body too long, too stretched out. Its eyes were wide, empty pits that seemed to absorb the light around them. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I was trapped in place, my heart racing, my vision blurring. The thing stepped forward, its gaze fixed on me. Its mouth opened, a grotesque smile stretching across its face. The edges of its lips were cracked, as if they had been pulled too far, but the smile was empty. Hollow. A mockery of something human. It reached out a long, skeletal hand, its fingers twitching. I backed away, stumbling over my own feet. The tapping had started again, faster now, like a drumbeat, the rhythm pulsing in my chest, syncing with my heartbeat. No. No, please, my voice broke. I couldn't stop myself from crying out, but the figure didn't stop. It kept moving toward me, its eyes never leaving mine, its hand coming closer, closer. And then it stopped. The smile faded, replaced by something else. Something worse. Its eyes narrowed, the black pits of its gaze piercing into me. And then, in a voice that was far too calm, too familiar, it spoke again. The voice of the future. My voice. You can't escape. You never could. I couldn't breathe. The world around me went dark again, but this time there was no escape. No running. And then the tapping stopped. The silence was deafening. It was over. I woke up in my bed. My heart was still racing, my mind in a frenzy, as if the darkness from the alleyway had never truly left. I looked around, disoriented. The soft light of morning streamed through the window, bathing the room in a comforting glow. The familiar walls, the quiet hum of the city outside, everything seemed so normal, so ordinary. I tried to shake off the remnants of the nightmare, but something in my chest told me that it wasn't just a dream. It was real. It had to be. The fear, the tapping, the voice, it was all still with me, echoing in my mind like a fading memory that refused to let go. I reached for my phone, desperate to check the time, to ground myself in the present. But when I unlocked the screen, the first thing I saw was a missed call. From a hidden number. My heart skipped a beat. I swallowed hard, the breath caught in my throat as I stared at the screen. I had to be imagining things. The call had to be a coincidence. But I knew deep down that it wasn't. I clicked on the voicemail, my fingers trembling. As the message played, the voice crackled, distorted at first, then clearing, though it still had that eerie, static edge to it. You're still alive. But not for long. The future hasn't changed. It's still coming for you. You have to leave. Now. It's not just a nightmare. It's real. My blood ran cold. The voice, my voice, was unmistakable. And the words hit me like a punch to the gut. I didn't know what to believe anymore. Was this some twisted warning from the future, or was I losing my mind? I stood up, pacing the room, the walls feeling like they were closing in on me again. The tapping, the figure, it was all too vivid. Too real. But how? How could it be real if I was back in my own room? If the nightmare had been nothing more than a product of my mind? The tapping. The voice. The warning. I grabbed my jacket, determined to leave, to find answers. I couldn't stay here, not in a world that felt like it was shifting beneath me, not when I wasn't sure what was real anymore. I stepped outside, the cool air hitting my face, but the sense of dread clung to me, tightening its grip. The streets seemed so normal, so alive with the hum of everyday life, but all I could focus on was the gnawing sensation that I was being watched. The tapping. The voice. The future. It was too much. Too overwhelming. And as I walked down the familiar street, a sense of déjà vu washed over me, as if I had been here before, walking this same path, hearing these same sounds. I looked around, but no one seemed to notice the growing darkness around me, the creeping sense that something was wrong. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't stop. I had to keep moving. Keep running from whatever was coming. Whatever was watching me. As I turned a corner, I froze. At the end of the street, standing there in the distance, was a figure. Tall. Thin. Its face was obscured by shadows, but I knew who it was. The figure from the alley. My reflection. The thing that had been chasing me. I took a step back, my body trembling. The tapping started again, slow at first, but growing louder with every passing second. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. And then, just as I was about to turn and run, I heard the voice again. Clear. Familiar. You're too late, it said, and I felt the coldness of its words settle deep inside me. I knew then that I couldn't outrun this. I couldn't escape it. No matter how far I ran, no matter how much I tried to hide, the future, the dark thing that had already started, would always be there, waiting for me. It had always been waiting. And in that moment, I realized with horrifying clarity that the tapping, the shadows, the warnings, they weren't just a part of some nightmare. They were a part of me. They had always been. And no matter what I did, I would never be free. The future had already spoken. And it was coming for me. The tapping grew louder, closer, until it drowned out everything else. The world around me blurred into darkness, and I felt the cold hand once again, brushing against my skin, pulling me towards something I couldn't understand. And then, silence. Have you ever wondered what would happen if a book started to tell your story, but not in the way you expected? What if the words in it changed every time you turned the page? What if the book knew things about you that no one else did? It all started one rainy afternoon when I found the book. It was tucked away in a forgotten corner of the used bookstore, hidden behind stacks of other worn and dusty novels. The cover was a dark, almost unnatural shade of black, with no title, no author's name. It looked like any other old book at first glance, but there was something about it that caught my attention. A strange feeling tugged at me, as though the book had been waiting for me to find it. I picked it up, my fingers brushing against the pages as I pulled it from the shelf. It felt heavy in my hands, too heavy for such a small volume. I couldn't shake the sensation that I was holding something important, something alive, though I had no idea why I thought that. Maybe it was the way the air in the bookstore seemed to grow still, or the way the flickering light overhead seemed to dim the moment I touched it. I made my way home, the book cradled in my arms, my mind buzzing with curiosity. At first, I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But as I sat down to read, that's when it started. The words on the page were different. I could have sworn they weren't there before. At first, it was just small things. A sentence shifted slightly. A word was replaced by another. I shrugged it off, thinking it was nothing more than a printing error. But when I turned the page again, the entire chapter had changed. The characters in the story were now walking through a setting I didn't recognize. They were discussing things that were too close to my life, too close to my own thoughts, to be a coincidence. I blinked, flipping back to the previous page, but it had changed too. The words were different, the sentences rearranged. The book was no longer just telling a story, it was telling my story. Confused, I continued reading, my heart beginning to race as I realized something was terribly wrong. The next page was worse. The book described a scene in my apartment, down to the smallest details, the books on my shelf, the half-empty coffee cup on the table, the way I had left my jacket hanging over the back of the chair. It was as if the book knew exactly what was happening around me, what I was thinking, and what I was doing at that very moment. I looked around my room, suddenly feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The silence was suffocating. I could hear my heartbeat, the soft click of the clock on the wall. It felt like the world had shifted, like the walls of my apartment were closing in on me, pressing in on me, and the only thing I could focus on was the book in my hands. The next page read, "You are not alone." The words were so clear, so specific, it made me shiver. I felt my pulse quicken. I wanted to stop reading, but I couldn't. My hands shook as I turned the next page. It didn't make sense. How could this book know these things about me? How could it know my thoughts, my fears? But it did. It knew everything. Every detail of my life, things I had never told anyone. Things I had forgotten, locked away in the deepest corners of my mind. The next page described a memory, one I had buried so far in my past I thought it was gone forever. It was of a time when I was just a child, standing in my grandmother's old house. The smell of pine, the sound of wind howling through the trees outside. I hadn't thought about that house in years. But the book had. It knew. And as I read, the memory came rushing back, clearer than ever. But the story didn't stop there. The pages began to describe things that hadn't happened yet. Things that were still to come. It was like the book had a mind of its own, twisting time, shifting reality, bending it to its will. It wasn't just telling my past, it was shaping my future. It was changing the text, and with every change, I felt myself being pulled further into its grip. The sound of a knock on my door jolted me out of my trance. My heart raced, my hands trembling as I set the book down on the table. I stood frozen, the blood draining from my face. The knock came again, louder this time. I walked toward the door, every step feeling like a weight dragging me down. When I opened it, there was no one there. Just a shadow. A figure standing at the edge of the hallway. I couldn't make out its face, but I felt its presence, heavy and suffocating. I slammed the door shut, locking it. My pulse pounded in my ears. I turned to the table, where the book still lay open. The next page had already changed. The words were different now, more urgent, more direct. It read, "They're coming for you. The story has already been written." I backed away from the table, my mind reeling. Was this some kind of trick? Some twisted game? Or was I really reading my future? I glanced at the window. The figure was gone, but the feeling of being watched remained. The silence in my apartment had become oppressive, like a heavy fog filling the room. I couldn't escape it. The book knew too much. It knew everything. And with that knowledge, the terror began to grow. The story had changed. And so had I. The knock at the door echoed in my mind long after it stopped. I stood there, trembling, staring at the closed door as if it might open again, as if the figure would step through. But nothing happened. The apartment was silent once more, as if the world had paused, holding its breath. I couldn't stop thinking about the book. The way it had changed. The way it seemed to reach into my life, pulling out details that I had forgotten, things that no one should have known. I looked at it again, sitting innocently on the table, its pages open to the terrifying words that still haunted my mind. The story has already been written. What did that even mean? And who, or what, had written it? I had to know. I had to understand what was happening. My fingers itched to turn the page again, but a cold shiver ran down my spine. I wanted to keep reading, but part of me feared what I might find. The book had already known things about me. What if it knew even more? What if it could control me, shape my thoughts, my actions? What if, by reading it, I was giving it power over me? I took a deep breath and pushed the fear down. I couldn't stop now. Not while I was so close to uncovering the truth. Slowly, cautiously, I picked up the book and turned the page. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The words were arranged differently, the sentences restructured, but nothing that stood out. I exhaled, relieved for a moment. Maybe it was just a fluke, a strange coincidence. Maybe the book was just a strange object, one that didn't mean anything at all. But as I read, the words began to make sense. Too much sense. The passage described my apartment in vivid detail, more so than any outsider could possibly know. It even mentioned the small cracks in the ceiling, the ones I'd always ignored. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just describing the room, it was describing my mind, my thoughts, my fears. It was reading me. It wasn't just that the book was telling my story. It was shaping it, bending it, twisting it into something new. The more I read, the more I felt as though I was being sucked into the narrative, pulled away from the reality I knew and into something darker, something more sinister. She could hear the voice in the hallway. The knock came again, louder this time. She hesitated before opening the door. What awaited her on the other side was not what she expected. I looked up. The knock on the door was still fresh in my mind, and now it was as if the book was rewriting the events, making them its own. The words on the page were more than just a reflection of my life. They were now a prediction, a glimpse into what might happen next. I glanced nervously toward the door. There was no sound, no movement. But the air in the apartment felt heavier, more suffocating. The silence had become oppressive, like the calm before a storm. I couldn't help myself. I turned the page again. This time, the words were different. The book didn't just describe the scene in my apartment, it described me, exactly what I was doing, down to the smallest detail. It even described the way my hands were trembling as I held the book, the way my heart raced, the way my breath hitched in my chest. She sat down, trembling, unable to escape the feeling of being watched. The book in her hands was not just a book. It was her future. I froze. The words burned into my mind. The book had written my future. I hadn't just been reading a story. I had been reading my own destiny, as if the book knew exactly where I was headed, what would happen to me. I slammed the book shut, gasping for air. My fingers still gripped it tightly, but the sense of panic, of dread, had taken over. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in on me. I needed to get rid of it. I needed to destroy it. But as soon as the thought crossed my mind, I heard it again. The knock. It was louder this time, urgent. It was as if the book was somehow making it happen, pushing the events forward, pulling me deeper into its control. I glanced at the door, my heart pounding. Was it real? Was someone actually there? Or was this just another manipulation from the book? I couldn't trust my own senses anymore. The line between reality and the story was blurring, and I didn't know how much longer I could hold on. The knock came again, faster now, and I knew I couldn't wait any longer. I stood up, my knees weak, my mind spinning. I had to know who was at the door. Maybe they had answers. Maybe they could explain what was happening. Maybe they could stop the book, stop whatever force was controlling me. But as I reached for the door handle, a thought stopped me cold. What if the book already knew what I would do next? I paused, my hand hovering over the knob. What if, by opening the door, I was playing right into its hands? What if it had already written this moment into the pages, and there was no way out? I hesitated, frozen in place. My mind was racing, my thoughts tangled in confusion and fear. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Then I heard the voice. It was faint at first, a whisper in the back of my mind, but it grew louder with every passing second. Don't open the door. And I realized then that the book had already written this too. It wasn't just telling my story. It was controlling it. Every choice I made, every step I took, had already been decided. And the worst part was, I didn't know if I could stop it. I stood there, my hand still hovering over the door handle, paralyzed by the weight of the voice in my head. It wasn't just a voice, it was a command. A warning. And I knew, deep down, that if I opened the door, something irreversible would happen. But how could I just ignore it? The knock was louder now, insistent, demanding. Someone was out there, and they were waiting for me. I had to know who it was. I had to know if the book had somehow pulled them into this twisted version of my reality. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours. My heart was beating so fast it hurt, and the book, that damn book, felt heavier in my hands, as if it were pulling me toward the door, making it impossible to resist. I could feel the coldness of the doorknob through my trembling fingers. The air in the room was thick with the tension, and my mind was a whirlpool of conflicting thoughts. Was I supposed to trust the voice, or was it just another manipulation? What if the voice was lying to me, trying to keep me trapped here, in this never-ending loop of fear? With a sharp breath, I pulled my hand back from the door. I couldn't open it. Not yet. Not until I knew what was happening. I needed answers. I turned away from the door, retreating back into the apartment. My legs felt weak, like they were about to give out under me. I stumbled toward the table, where the book lay open, its pages waiting for me. The words on the pages had already written so much of my life. What else would they reveal if I kept reading? But even as I considered picking it up, I hesitated. The voice in my head, the one that had warned me not to open the door, grew louder again. Don't read it anymore. It's already too late. A shiver ran down my spine. I didn't know what to do. I was trapped in a nightmare of my own making. And every time I thought I could escape it, the book pulled me back in, drawing me closer to the edge of something I couldn't understand. I grabbed my phone from the table, hoping that maybe calling someone, anyone, could snap me out of this. But when I unlocked it, my heart stopped. There was a message. It was from an unknown number. Don't trust the book. It knows you more than you know yourself. And once you open the door, it's too late. I stared at the screen, my fingers trembling as I tried to process the words. My mind was reeling. The voice in my head. The book. The knocking at the door. Was this real? Was someone out there? Or was it just another part of the book's control over me? I wanted to throw the phone, to scream, to break free from this twisted web. But the knock came again. This time, it was softer. Gentle. Almost coaxing. But it still had that same urgency behind it. I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't escape it. I took a step toward the door, and the book on the table seemed to pulse with life. It was as if it knew what I was about to do. As if it was whispering, urging me to follow its path. I stopped. I had to make a decision. The knocking grew louder, more demanding, as if the person on the other side of the door could sense my hesitation. But I didn't trust it. I didn't trust any of this. I couldn't let the book control me any longer. I backed away from the door. My hands were shaking. The air in the apartment felt stifling, oppressive. Every part of me screamed to open the door, to face whatever was waiting on the other side. But I knew that if I did, I might never come back. I grabbed the book from the table. Its pages fluttered, as if it had a life of its own. The words danced in front of me, flickering, changing, but one thing remained constant, the fear. It was there, in every line, in every sentence. And it was growing, pushing me further into madness. I glanced back at the door, hearing the knock once more. But this time, I didn't just hear the knock. I heard a voice. A low, familiar voice. It's me. Open the door. You don't know what you're doing. I froze. The voice, it was my voice. But it was twisted, distorted, like it came from a different version of me, a version that was lost, consumed by whatever had happened here. I looked down at the book, my fingers trembling as I opened it again. This time, the words were different. They weren't just describing the room, my thoughts, or my fears. They were describing me. She felt the coldness in the air, the weight of the book in her hands. The door behind her knocked again, louder this time, as if demanding her attention. The voice in her head urged her to open it, but she hesitated. She knew that what was on the other side was not what it seemed. And yet, she couldn't resist. She was drawn to it, as if the door held the answers to everything. The book was rewriting my thoughts. It wasn't just predicting what I would do. It was manipulating me, pushing me toward the inevitable. I took another step back, my mind racing. I didn't know what was real anymore. The knocking, the voice, the words on the page, were any of them really mine? I didn't have time to think anymore. The knock was louder now, and the door seemed to tremble in response. The book was no longer just a book. It was a force, an entity, controlling everything. And I was powerless to stop it. The door shook violently, and I knew that whatever was waiting on the other side wasn't going to wait much longer. I turned the handle. The door creaked as it slowly swung open, the sound like a low, eerie whisper that seemed to fill the entire room. My heart pounded in my chest as I peered into the darkness beyond the threshold, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting. The air outside the door was thick with a strange chill, far colder than it should have been for this time of night. My breath fogged in front of me, the chill creeping up my spine as I took a cautious step forward, my eyes scanning the empty hallway. Nothing. No one. But the knocking had stopped. And that alone felt wrong. I stood there, uncertain. Should I go out into the hallway? Should I just close the door and lock myself inside? Everything inside me screamed to leave, to escape the heavy weight of the unknown that pressed against me from all directions. But I couldn't shake the feeling that if I turned away, if I ignored this now, something would follow me, something far worse. I stepped over the threshold, barely making a sound as I moved deeper into the dark hallway. The flickering lights above cast long shadows along the walls, making them seem to twist and writhe in ways that felt unnatural. My hand still gripped the book tightly, its pages cold against my fingertips. I could feel the weight of it in my chest, like it was pushing me forward, guiding my every movement. Every step I took felt like it was not my own. And then, the moment I stepped away from the door, it slammed shut behind me with a force that rattled the walls. I whirled around, heart leaping into my throat. But when I reached for the door handle, it was gone. The door, the hallway, the entire apartment, all of it was gone. In its place was an endless, oppressive void. Black, empty, silent. I stumbled back, unable to process what had just happened. The hallway I had just stepped into now felt like a memory, as if it never existed. The book in my hand started to grow warm, almost pulsing with an unfamiliar energy. What is this? I thought, panic rising in my chest. Where am I? The answer came as a voice in my head, sharp and clear, as if the book itself was speaking to me. You've crossed over now. There is no way back. I wanted to scream, to throw the book away, to make it stop. But my body wouldn't listen. I was frozen, my mind overwhelmed by the words of the book. The floor beneath my feet shifted, the blackness around me stretching further, swallowing any trace of light. I was falling, but there was no ground, no walls, just a sense of weightlessness, a sinking feeling that gnawed at my insides. And through it all, the book in my hands began to whisper. It knows you. It knows your every thought, your every fear. The words started to blur as they appeared on the pages, morphing into something new, something far darker than before. I could feel the pages turning in my hands, faster than I could comprehend, like the book was telling a story of my life that I didn't want to hear. And it wasn't just my past, it was the future too. The future it was creating. A vision suddenly flashed before my eyes. I saw myself, standing in front of a mirror, my reflection twisted and distorted. But it wasn't just the mirror, it was the world around me. The air shimmered with an unnatural light, and I could hear strange whispers, the language of something ancient, something far beyond human understanding. The image in the mirror shifted. And in an instant, I saw me, but it wasn't me anymore. The person in the mirror was smiling. A cruel, twisted grin stretched across its face, eyes hollow, staring directly at me with an unsettling familiarity. It was like looking into the future, but not my future. A future that wasn't mine, a future that had already been written. I blinked, and the image vanished, leaving me staring at the blank, empty space around me. The knocking returned. But this time, it wasn't just a knock, it was a pounding, relentless, as though someone, or something, was trying to break through. The sound grew louder, deafening, as if the entire void was collapsing in on itself. I turned around, but there was nothing to see, nothing to explain where the noise was coming from. It's already too late. I couldn't stop myself from repeating those words in my mind, a mantra that echoed through my skull like a warning, a curse. My eyes darted to the book again, and this time, the pages were different. They weren't just words, they were images. Distorted faces, places I recognized, but not quite right. My hands trembled as I flipped through the pages, unable to look away, even though every fiber of my being screamed at me to stop. There it was again. Another image, this time more vivid than before. The mirror. But this time, the reflection wasn't smiling. It was reaching out, grabbing at the edges of the glass. I gasped, stumbling backward. The door I had just opened appeared again, right in front of me, its surface flickering like an illusion. Behind it, I could see a figure standing in the darkness. Its face was obscured, but I knew without a doubt who it was. It was me. A sharp, guttural voice echoed from somewhere, pulling me back to reality, or what was left of it. You should have never opened the door. And then, in the same instant, I felt the world shift again, pulling me into something deeper, darker, as if the book had claimed me, body and soul. I could feel it now, seeping into my very being. Its words, its images, its twisted version of my life, they were becoming my reality. The knocking stopped. The mirror faded. And the book in my hands was the only thing left. But it was more than just a book now. It was my future. And my past. It was everything. And there was no way out. Not anymore. I couldn't tell how long I had been standing there. Time had lost all meaning, every second stretching and warping like the distorted pages of the book. My hands were shaking, the weight of the book growing heavier with every passing moment. The oppressive silence was suffocating, but the strange sensation of being watched never left me. The darkness seemed to pulse, thrown with a life of its own, and my mind raced. What had I done? How had I crossed into this place? Was it truly me in the mirror, or had the book somehow changed me? The air itself seemed to hum with an energy I couldn't understand, like it was waiting for something or someone to make the next move. The knocking began again, louder this time, insistent. It seemed to be coming from behind me, but when I turned, nothing was there. The hallway, the walls, the door, all had disappeared, leaving only the void. I tried to breathe, tried to steady myself, but my heart was racing in my chest, the fear gnawing at me from every direction. I couldn't escape this. I couldn't escape it. The book. The book was the key. But it was more than just a key. It was a trap. A force that was controlling me, pulling me deeper into the abyss. I had thought I was in control, but I was wrong. I had opened it, I had allowed it to take me, and now there was no turning back. I opened the book again, my eyes scanning the shifting text. It was different this time. The pages were no longer just words, but images, flashes of my life, of moments I had never witnessed, of paths I had never taken. I stopped at one page, frozen in place. The text was clear now, more vivid than ever, and the words felt as if they were being spoken directly into my mind. You've crossed the threshold. There's no escaping what comes next. I shuddered, the weight of those words sinking deep into my bones. My mind was reeling, unable to make sense of it. How could the book know that? How could it know what I was thinking, what I was feeling? Was it telling me the truth, or was this just another part of the trap? I snapped the book shut, but the images remained. They lingered in my mind, flashing like a bad dream. I couldn't escape them. I couldn't escape this place. And then, just when I thought I might lose my grip on reality completely, I heard it again. A voice. Soft at first, like a whisper carried on the wind, but then growing louder, clearer. It's not too late. I jerked around, my eyes wide, heart pounding in my chest. I was alone, or at least, I thought I was. But the voice, where was it coming from? The whispering grew into a steady hum, the words now clear and unmistakable. You can still change it. You can stop it before it's too late. I clutched the book in my hands, almost instinctively. The voice was urging me, but what was it trying to tell me? Was there truly a way out of this, or had I already sealed my fate? My pulse quickened as the space around me began to shift again. The black void seemed to break apart, splintering like shattered glass. And then, slowly, painfully, a shape began to form. A shadow. No, not a shadow, a figure. The figure from the mirror. The one that had been grinning at me, reaching for me. It was now standing before me, its form no longer just an image and a reflection, but flesh and bone. It was me. I stared at myself, but it wasn't me, not really. It was a twisted version of me, its face gaunt and hollow, eyes wide with an unsettling emptiness. You're too late, it whispered, the voice somehow both mine and not mine, echoing in my mind. You cannot escape your fate. I am your future. The words were like a punch to the gut, and I staggered back, my breath caught in my throat. I wanted to run, to fight, to do anything to escape the nightmare that was unfolding before me, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure took a step forward, and I could feel the coldness of its presence, like it was pulling the very warmth from the air. I opened the book again, desperately searching for any way out, but the pages were blank now. The book had turned on me. It had consumed me, and now it was doing the same to everything around me. It's over, I thought, the realization sinking in. But just as the figure reached out, its bony hand hovering inches from my face, the book snapped shut with a loud crack. The world around me trembled, the void fracturing into 1,000 shards of light and darkness. And then, silence. The figure was gone. The void was gone. I stood alone, gasping for breath, my hands trembling as I looked around. I was back in my room, the book lying innocently in my hands. The darkness was gone. The shadows had retreated. The only thing left was the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my chest. But I knew that this was only temporary. The book hadn't finished with me. It never would. And no matter how hard I tried, I would never be free of it. I glanced at the book one last time, the pages now eerily still, the words silent. but deep inside, I could feel it. The story was still being written, and I was still a part of it. The knocking started again, faint at first, but growing louder. My heart stopped. I knew what it meant. The door was opening again, and this time there was no way to close it. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. At first, it was something small, something insignificant. A cup. I had just finished my coffee and put the cup down on the kitchen counter, like I always did. But when I turned around, it was gone. No sign of it anywhere. I checked the sink, the table, the living room. Nothing. My mind raced. Had I misplaced it? Was I just tired and not remembering correctly? It felt like I was losing grip on something, but I couldn't figure out what. Days passed, and the feeling of unease grew. It wasn't just the cup anymore. It was the photograph. My favorite one, the one of my parents and me on a family trip. I'd placed it on the mantel the night before, and when I went to look at it the next morning, it was gone. Just vanished. Again, I searched. I checked every drawer, every corner of the house. Nothing. But the worst part was that I couldn't remember taking it down. The memory of it being there, in its usual spot, was fading. I wondered if I had moved it myself, but the more I thought about it, the more uncertain I became. Then, the chair. My favorite armchair, the one I always sat in after work, was gone. I had left it there the evening before, sitting by the window. Now, it was just an empty space. I walked around the house again, checking each room. I couldn't find it. My thoughts started spiraling. Was I forgetting things? Was I moving things and not remembering? Or was something else happening? The house felt different. The quiet was suffocating. The walls seemed to close in as if they were breathing, shifting, becoming part of something darker. I tried to ignore it, to tell myself I was imagining things. But then came the doors. The door to the study, the one I had walked past 1,000 times, was gone. It wasn't just opened or closed, it was missing. The space where it should have been was empty. No frame, no hinges, no sign that there had ever been a door at all. I stood in front of the empty space, frozen. My breath caught in my throat. I had seen that door just yesterday. I knew it had been there. But now it was as if it had never existed. Was I losing my mind? Was I forgetting things, or was something changing? I walked through the house, checking every room, every corner. My hands were shaking. There were more missing things now, books, trinkets, even the vase on the hallway table. Each time I noticed another detail gone, the panic rose higher. The house, my home, was slipping away. But it wasn't just the objects. It was the space itself. It felt as if the walls were shifting. The hallways seemed longer, the rooms emptier, the corners darker. Every place I went, I felt watched, but I couldn't tell by what. There was something there, something lurking just beyond my sight, waiting for me to turn my back. The quiet was oppressive now, thick with an unspoken presence. I tried calling my friend, desperate for someone else to confirm what I was seeing, but when I reached her, she sounded distant. Her voice echoed strangely, as if we weren't in the same place. She didn't seem to understand my panic. "Are you sure you're okay? Maybe you're just overthinking things. You know you've been stressed lately." Stressed? No, this wasn't stress. This was real. The world was changing, and I was losing pieces of it. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of it. The house was eerily still. My own breathing was the only sound I could hear. The quiet seemed to press down on me, suffocating me. I closed my eyes for just a moment, and when I opened them again, I saw it. A figure standing in the doorway to the bedroom. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. But when I blinked, the figure was gone. Was it real? Or had I imagined it? I wasn't sure anymore. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't think straight. I needed to figure out what was happening. Something was wrong with the house, with me, with everything. The missing objects, the shifting walls, the strange feeling of being watched, it was all connected. But how? I got out of bed, determined to find answers. My feet moved on their own, carrying me to the study. But when I got there, I stopped in my tracks. The door that had been gone. It was there now, standing in its place. I stared at it, confused. How could it have returned? Was I losing my mind? I reached for the handle and opened the door. The room beyond was dark. Too dark. But I stepped inside anyway. As soon as I did, I heard it. A sound, faint at first, like a whisper. But it wasn't just a whisper. It was a voice. A voice I knew. "Why are you here?" the voice asked. "You don't belong here." I froze. It was my voice. But it wasn't me. It was a different version of me. A darker, twisted version. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out, my voice shaking. The figure in the shadows stepped forward, and as it did, the air around me grew colder. I tried to back away, but my feet wouldn't move. I was stuck, unable to escape. The walls seemed to close in, and the whispering voice grew louder. "You know who I am," it said, its voice now a low growl. "I am the one who remembers everything. I remember what you've forgotten." And just like that, I understood. The house wasn't just changing, it was erasing things. Not just the objects, but me. And now, I was starting to disappear too. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The house had never felt so silent, so empty. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind through the windows, seemed to make the quiet even more oppressive. The missing objects, the cup, the photograph, the chair, were all small things on their own, but taken together, they made me feel like I was losing something far more important than just physical possessions. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that I was just imagining things, but the feeling wouldn't go away. It was as if the house itself was shifting around me, subtly changing in ways I couldn't explain. I tried to focus on work to take my mind off it. But when I sat down at my desk, I couldn't help but notice the calendar on the wall. The date was wrong. I stared at it for a long time, convinced that I was seeing things. The date was marked as a day from weeks ago, weeks I couldn't even remember. I grabbed my phone to check the actual date. But when I did, it was the same as what the calendar said. Ow! I had been keeping track of everything, hadn't I? Of course, I had. But now, I was unsure of anything. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something or someone there. Every time I blinked, I felt like I was missing a moment, like something had changed while I wasn't looking. The house felt like it was shrinking around me, like my world was being slowly erased. The doorframe where the study door should have been was still there, but the door itself was gone. Again. Had it ever really been there? I couldn't be sure anymore. I needed to find an explanation, anything to make sense of this madness. Maybe I was just overworked. Maybe I needed a break. I grabbed my jacket, telling myself I would go for a walk, breathe some fresh air, and clear my mind. But the moment I stepped outside, the world felt wrong. The streets seemed unfamiliar, even though I knew them so well. The buildings seemed to shift in the corner of my vision. It was like I was walking through a dream, and nothing was solid anymore. I went back inside quickly, locking the door behind me. The house greeted me with its heavy silence, its oppressive air. I moved to the kitchen and opened the fridge, desperate for something to ground me, something familiar. But even that was wrong. There was nothing inside except a half-empty bottle of milk, some wilted vegetables, and a jar of mustard. I'd had leftovers in there just yesterday, at least, I thought I had. My stomach churned. I could feel the walls closing in on me. My hands trembled as I shut the fridge door and turned away, not sure where to go next. That's when I saw it. A piece of paper sitting on the coffee table in the living room. It wasn't there before. I was sure of it. I hadn't left anything out. I picked it up, my heart racing as I saw the messy handwriting scrawled across the page. It was a note written in my own handwriting. You have to leave. It's already too late. The words felt like a punch to the gut. How had this note gotten here? How could it be in my handwriting if I didn't remember writing it? I could feel the cold sweat gathering on my skin. Something was terribly wrong. I stood there, staring at the note, unsure of what to do. My mind raced, spinning in circles. I couldn't think clearly. Every thought felt like it was slipping away, like I was watching it fade from my grasp. The house groaned around me, the walls seeming to bend and sway as if they were alive. I heard a noise behind me, faint at first, like a whisper. I spun around, my pulse quickening. There was nothing there. Just the empty, silent room. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The darkness in the corners of the room seemed to be creeping closer, and I couldn't tell if it was real or if my mind was just playing tricks on me. I had to get out. I had to escape this place before it swallowed me whole. But as I reached for the door, my hand froze in midair. It wasn't the door to the living room anymore. It was the door to the study again. Ow! I backed away slowly, my eyes locked on the door as it seemed to stretch and warp before me. I could feel the room shifting around me, but it wasn't just the room. It was everything. It was the whole house, the world itself, bending and twisting. And then I heard it again, the voice. The one that had whispered my name in the darkness. It came from behind the door. You can't leave, it said, its voice cold and final. You've already lost. I slammed my eyes shut, trying to block out the voice, trying to block out the feeling of the walls closing in around me. But no matter how tightly I closed my eyes, I couldn't escape it. The house was changing, and I was becoming part of it. I opened my eyes again, and everything was different. The door to the study was no longer a door at all. It was just a wall. A flat, featureless surface where the door had once been. I was trapped. Trapped in a house that was erasing everything. And as I stood there, frozen in place, I realized the terrifying truth. I was becoming one of the things that was disappearing. and I had no idea how to stop it. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the thudding echoing in my ears. My breath was shallow, and every tiny noise, the creak of the floorboards, the whir of the refrigerator, seemed to amplify in the thick silence of the house. I was suffocating in it, trapped by a reality that no longer felt like my own. The door, or what used to be the door to the study, stared back at me like a blank, featureless wall. I reached out, my fingertips trembling as I touched the cold surface. It was smooth. Too smooth. My hand slid down it, searching for any trace of the handle or any sign that the door had ever existed. But there was nothing. Just the emptiness of a wall where the door had once been. I pulled my hand away, stepping back with a shaky breath. The house seemed to be watching me, as though it were alive, its every movement subtle but deliberate. I turned toward the hallway, looking down at the space where the kitchen and living room met. But something was wrong with the hallway. It didn't look the same. It was longer. The walls seemed to curve inward, and the shadows stretched unnaturally, as if they were alive, creeping along the floor. I forced myself to take a step forward. Then another. Each footstep felt heavy, like the house itself was pulling at my heels, refusing to let me go. I reached the end of the hall, and the door to the kitchen was gone. Just another empty space, another void where it shouldn't have been. What was happening to me? To the house? I stumbled backward, my mind racing. There had to be an explanation. I couldn't be losing my mind. I wasn't crazy. I'd been here before, in this very house. I'd lived here for years, and it had always been the same until now. Until today. I looked around, desperate for something familiar. A picture frame. A chair. A single object that hadn't disappeared, that hadn't shifted into something else. But no, everything was changing. A sound. A low, scraping noise. It came from the hallway behind me, quiet at first but growing louder, like something, or someone, dragging its feet across the floor. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the darkness. Nothing. The noise stopped as suddenly as it had started. My pulse was racing, my palms slick with sweat. I felt like I was standing on the edge of something, waiting for the floor to give way beneath me. I needed to get out of here. I needed to leave, but the door, no, the wall blocked my only escape. Get out, I whispered to myself, but even the words felt hollow in the stillness. Get out, before it's too late. But where could I go? The house had already started swallowing me whole. The walls were closing in, the air thickening with an oppressive weight. I had to get out of this house, but the more I moved, the more it felt like I was only getting deeper into it. Suddenly, the sound came again, a scraping, followed by a faint rustling, like something being dragged across the floor. I spun around, but there was still nothing there. Just shadows, stretching across the walls, pulling themselves closer like they were trying to swallow me whole. I forced my legs to move, though every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to escape. I walked cautiously toward the front door, praying that it would still be there, that it hadn't vanished too. But as I reached for the handle, something stopped me. A cold, suffocating pressure settled in my chest, a warning that I couldn't ignore. I turned slowly, my breath caught in my throat. Standing at the end of the hallway was a figure. It was me. Or at least, it looked like me. The same height, the same features, but its eyes were empty, hollow, like it had never been truly alive. It didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, staring at me, its expression blank and cold. I couldn't breathe. My mind refused to process what I was seeing. Was it a trick of the light? Was I imagining it? But no matter how much I willed myself to look away, to believe it wasn't real, the figure remained. I took a step back, then another. I was shaking uncontrollably now, my legs feeling like they were made of rubber. My body was telling me to run, but my feet were rooted to the spot, as if the house itself was holding me in place. The figure lifted its hand, pointing toward me. It didn't speak, but I could feel its cold, lifeless presence pressing down on me, suffocating me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My voice was gone. I looked at it, at me, and the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just some strange hallucination. This was me. The me that was disappearing. The me that was being erased from the world, piece by piece. And I couldn't stop it. With a last, desperate effort, I forced myself to move. I turned, stumbling toward the door again. The figure didn't follow me, but I could feel its gaze burning into my back. The house seemed to pulse around me, as though it were alive, waiting for me to make a mistake. I reached the door and yanked it open, not caring what lay outside. I didn't care anymore. But as I stepped out into the world beyond, I realized the truth. The house had never let me go. It had already claimed me. The street outside was empty. The houses stood still in the late afternoon light, their windows reflecting the dimming sky. The world looked so ordinary, so normal. But I knew better now. Nothing was ordinary anymore. I stood on the curb, trying to breathe, trying to remind myself that I was still in control, still connected to something real. But the chill that had settled in my chest didn't leave. It was a constant, suffocating presence, like the house itself was still holding me. I walked down the sidewalk, feeling the weight of the quiet around me. My feet dragged with each step, as though they were bound by invisible chains, forcing me to keep moving. The houses around me, the trees lining the road, all of it felt wrong. It was like I had stepped into a world that didn't belong to me, or worse, a world that didn't exist at all. I stopped. There was something in the distance. A figure standing under the street lamp at the end of the block. The light flickered above it, casting shadows that seemed to stretch far longer than they should. It stood perfectly still, as though waiting for me. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. The figure looked familiar, too familiar. But it couldn't be. No. I shook my head and turned away, determined to keep moving. The last thing I needed was another version of myself haunting me. I quickened my pace, trying to ignore the feeling creeping up my spine. But the more I walked, the more the air seemed to thicken around me. The street, once so full of life, had become unnervingly quiet. The only sound was the soft shuffle of my shoes on the pavement, like I was the last person left in the world. Suddenly, I froze. The world around me shifted, the houses bending and twisting at the edges of my vision, like they were melting into the atmosphere. The sky above darkened in an instant, the once clear blue now a sickly shade of gray. The air smelled stale, almost rotten. I glanced back. The figure was closer now, much closer. It was standing at the corner of the block, its face still obscured in the shadow of the lamp. But something was different about it this time. There was no longer any doubt in my mind. It was me. Or was it? My pulse hammered in my ears. I couldn't trust my senses anymore. How could I be sure? The thing moved forward, its steps slow and deliberate. I wanted to run, to scream, but my legs refused to obey. I was frozen, locked in place by the weight of what was happening. The thing reached out its hand, and I felt a wave of icy fear wash over me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was stare as it slowly, deliberately, took a step toward me. Each movement was in perfect sync with mine, as if it were mimicking me. It was like looking into a mirror, but the reflection wasn't my own. It stopped inches away from me, its cold, lifeless eyes locking onto mine. I couldn't tear my gaze away. I could feel the pressure of its stare, as though it was trying to peel the truth out of me. I opened my mouth to speak, but no sound came. My voice was gone, as if it had been stolen by the thing in front of me. I reached out, trembling, desperate to touch it, to make sense of this nightmare. But my hand passed right through it. The figure flickered, like a broken image on a screen, and then, just like that, it was gone. I stumbled back, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in my chest. The world around me was silent again, but the silence was deafening. It pressed in on me from all sides, squeezing tighter and tighter with every passing second. Was it over? Was it done? I didn't know. The truth was slipping away, like sand through my fingers. I turned and started walking again, unsure of where I was going, unsure of anything. I passed houses that no longer looked familiar, streets that twisted and distorted the further I went. The world was unraveling around me. But the worst part? The worst part was that I wasn't sure if it was the world that was changing or if it was me. I turned a corner and suddenly I was back on my street. The street I had been trying to escape. The house loomed in the distance, dark and foreboding, like it had been waiting for me the whole time. I hesitated. I had already left, hadn't I? I'd walked away, and yet here I was again. I stepped closer. The front door was open. The sound of soft footsteps echoed from inside. It was my footsteps. But how could that be? I hadn't gone inside. I hadn't. I froze, realizing what was happening. It wasn't the house that was trapping me. It was me. I was the one who had been erasing myself, piece by piece. And now there was nothing left. I stood there, in front of the open door, staring into the darkness beyond. The house was waiting, but so was I. And I knew, deep down, that I'd never leave. I stood there, staring at the doorway, as if waiting for the house to breathe, to move, to make its next terrifying step. But nothing happened. The silence stretched on, suffocating and heavy. Every creak, every faint rustle of the leaves in the yard felt amplified, like the world was holding its breath. It was then that I heard it, footsteps. Soft, deliberate, like a distant echo. I didn't turn around. I knew better than that. It was me, or at least the version of me that had been left behind, growing more insistent with each passing moment. The door beckoned, but I didn't want to go inside. My legs, however, moved on their own accord. They carried me through the door and into the house, where the air smelled stale and thick. The familiar scent of dust and wood was there, but underneath it, there was something else, a sharp, metallic tang, like the smell of old pennies or blood. I glanced around. The hallway stretched before me, its shadows deeper than they should have been, as though the walls themselves were closing in. It was the same hallway, the same walls, yet everything felt wrong. The floor creaked under my feet as I took a hesitant step forward, my mind reeling, my heart pounding louder than I thought possible. I could hear the soft murmur of voices, voices that were too quiet to understand, too faint to be real. I turned in the direction of the sound, the darkness pressing in closer with each passing second. There, in the corner of the hallway, was a figure. A shadow. No, not a shadow. It was a person. It was me again. I took a shaky step back, my body trembling with a fear I couldn't control. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, watching me, its eyes empty but knowing, as though it understood something I didn't. I took another step back, and the figure mirrored me. I stopped. It stopped. We were locked in some kind of twisted dance. It wasn't even trying to hide itself anymore. It wasn't hiding because it knew exactly what I feared. The mirror image of me stepped forward, its movements jerky, unnatural. It seemed to ripple in and out of focus, as though it didn't quite belong in this space, in this time. And then, without warning, it reached out. Its hand was pale, almost translucent in the dim light. The fingertips brushed against my skin, and a coldness like nothing I had ever felt surged through me. I gasped. The touch was an instant shock, like cold water freezing every part of my body. My mind screamed, but my mouth was dry. The figure's hand passed right through me, like I was nothing more than a memory. And then I knew. It was me. All of me. Everything I had lost, everything I couldn't remember, everything that had been erased. I had erased myself over and over again, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but this thing standing in front of me, wearing my face, wearing my life. The figure tilted its head, and for a moment I thought I saw something else in its eyes. A flicker of recognition. But no, there was nothing there but emptiness. I wanted to scream, to run, to tear myself away from this nightmare, but I was frozen. Every part of me was trapped in that one moment, caught between what was real and what was not. The figure leaned in closer. I could feel its cold breath on my face, and my chest tightened with the weight of the truth. It whispered, but the words were not mine. "You'll never leave," it said, its voice a harsh whisper that echoed in my skull. "You are already gone." I closed my eyes. When I opened them, the figure was gone. The hallway was empty again, but I wasn't alone. The house had swallowed me whole. Every sound, every step I took, every room I entered, it was all a reflection of me. And as I looked around, I realized there was no way out. Not because I couldn't physically leave, but because I had already left. The last detail was gone. My world, my reality, had faded, piece by piece, until there was only one thing left. Only one truth. And I was it. Have you ever been sure you were not alone, but every time you tried to reach out, the feeling slipped through your fingers, just out of grasp? What if you could hear the presence, but it always stayed one step ahead of you, pulling further away with every move you made? I heard those steps, and for the first time, I wondered if the silence between them was even more dangerous than the sound itself. It was late, well past midnight, when the first step echoed down the hallway. I had been lying in bed, unable to sleep, when I heard it, a soft, deliberate footfall on the wooden floorboards. My heart thudded in my chest, but I convinced myself it was nothing, maybe just the house settling. I tried to focus on the quiet darkness outside my window, the shadows that stretched long and unnoticed. I had lived in this old house for years, and I had grown used to its creaks and groans. But this felt different. The step wasn't the kind the house made when it shifted. It was purposeful. It was someone or something walking. I waited for the next sound, hoping it would fade, hoping it would just be a trick of my mind. But no, there it was again, a second step. Then a third. Slowly, as if timed to match my heartbeat, they grew louder, but just as I braced myself to get up, the steps didn't get closer. They started to move away. I sat up, confusion twisting inside me. The sound of footsteps, clear and unmistakable, was retreating down the hallway, away from my bedroom door. Why would they move away? They had to be close. I was sure of it. I slid out of bed quietly, my feet barely making a sound against the cool floor. I crept toward the door, my breath shallow. As I reached the hallway, I heard it again, the distinct, echoing steps, now at the far end of the corridor. I froze. The hallway was dark, as it always was at night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was there. Watching. Moving just out of reach. I called out, my voice trembling with uncertainty. "Hello? Is someone there?" No response. I took a cautious step forward, the air around me thick with tension. The steps continued, but no matter how fast I moved, no matter how hard I pushed myself forward, they always seemed to stay just beyond my reach. I found myself chasing them, step by step, inching my way down the corridor. But every time I felt like I was getting closer, the footsteps would fade, as if I were running after a shadow that could never be caught. I reached the end of the hallway, breathing heavily, and stopped. The house was eerily silent now, as if the very walls were holding their breath, waiting. My hand hovered over the doorknob, but something stopped me. It wasn't a sound, nor a movement, but a sensation. A feeling of wrongness that gnawed at me, deep in my gut. The air felt heavier, colder, almost suffocating. I opened the door slowly, expecting to find nothing but the familiar room. But as I stepped inside, the air shifted again. The floor beneath me creaked in a way it shouldn't have. And then, I heard it. The steps. Right outside the door. I turned sharply, heart pounding in my chest. But when I looked back, the hallway was empty. No one was there. Only the faint echo of retreating footsteps lingered in the air, growing quieter with each passing second until the silence returned, thick and suffocating. And I couldn't shake the thought that it wasn't a trick of my mind. It wasn't just an illusion. There was something, or someone, walking just beyond the reach of my understanding, playing with my senses, dragging me deeper into their web of uncertainty. I closed the door, pressing my back against it. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. But the more I thought, the more the question gnawed at me, who was walking down that hallway? And why did they always seem to fade away when I was so close to finding them? The days that followed were filled with the strange sensation that I was being watched, that something, someone, was just out of my reach, waiting for the perfect moment to show itself. But there were no more footsteps. No more sounds to reassure me that whatever it was still lingered nearby. The silence was overwhelming, suffocating, and I found myself constantly listening, straining to hear the faintest sound. I told myself I was imagining things. It was just the house, the age of the floors, the wind shifting through the cracks in the walls. I told myself over and over again, but deep down, I couldn't convince myself. Something about it felt off. The more I tried to ignore it, the more it consumed me. It wasn't until the third night that I heard them again. This time, the steps were louder. They started closer, much closer than before. I sat up, my pulse quickening, and I could feel my muscles tense in anticipation. The footsteps were no longer distant echoes. They were here, right outside my door. I held my breath, listening, waiting for them to fade like before. But they didn't. The steps halted right outside my bedroom door, and for a moment, everything was completely still. I could hear nothing except the beating of my own heart in my ears. It was almost as if whatever was out there was waiting too. A cold chill crept down my spine as I reached for the doorknob. I had to know. I had to see what was causing this, what was playing these games with my mind. I pulled open the door, expecting to find nothing, just the empty, silent hallway. But it wasn't empty. The dim light from the hallway cast long, jagged shadows on the walls. The air was thick, as if something unseen were moving just beyond the edges of my vision. And then, I saw it, a figure, dark and indistinct, standing at the end of the corridor. It wasn't fully human, not entirely. Its outline seemed to shift, like a shadow that couldn't hold its form. I blinked, and it was gone. Just gone. I stood there, frozen, staring at the empty hallway, my heart thundering in my chest. What was that? Had I imagined it? Or had I truly seen something that wasn't supposed to be there? I stepped out of my room, feeling the familiar weight of dread settle over me. The hallway stretched before me, the shadows seeming to deepen as I took each step. My feet felt heavy, unwilling to move forward, but I pushed myself. I had to know what was going on. The floorboards creaked under my weight, each sound amplified in the eerie stillness. The steps were gone. The figure was gone. But the feeling, this overwhelming sense of something watching me, something just beyond reach, was still there. I reached the end of the hallway, near the stairs, where I had heard the steps fade the first night. But now, as I stood there, I realized something terrifying. The stairs weren't quite as I remembered them. The shadows around them seemed to shift in unnatural ways. The railing that used to be on the left side of the stairs was now on the right. And the old, familiar portrait hanging on the wall, one of my grandparents, was gone, replaced by a blank space, as if it had never been there. Panic surged through me. I backed away slowly, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My mind was racing. Had someone moved things around? Had I been too sleep-deprived to notice the changes? But no, this wasn't right. The house was different. Something about it had changed, and I didn't know how or why. As I turned to go back to my room, I heard it again. The steps. But this time, they didn't fade away. They were closer, far too close. My pulse skyrocketed, my legs freezing in place. I could feel them now, just behind me. The steps were slow, deliberate, coming closer with every passing second. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Then, a voice. It was a whisper, soft but unmistakable, drifting into my ear. "It's not your house anymore." The words sent a cold shiver down my spine, but I couldn't bring myself to turn around. I stood there, unable to move, every part of me screaming to run, to escape, but my body refused to listen. The steps were almost at my back. I could hear them, hear the faintest sound of breathing, shallow and ragged. And just as I felt a hand brush my shoulder, the footsteps stopped. The silence returned, thicker than ever. But now, it was suffocating. I could feel the weight of the air pressing in on me, the sensation of being trapped. I slowly turned, but when I looked behind me, nothing. The hallway was empty. But I knew better. Something had changed. Something was here, just out of my reach, and no matter how hard I tried to escape, it was always just a step ahead. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me into the daylight. The sunlight, usually warm and reassuring, felt distant and hollow. The house, the very walls around me, seemed alien, like a place I had once known but had since lost any real connection to. I went through the motions of my morning routine: shower, breakfast, a quick glance at the paper, but my mind was elsewhere. It kept returning to those footsteps. The whisper, the figure, and the feeling of something or someone out of place. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head. That maybe, just maybe, I had been under too much stress, my imagination running wild. But as I sat in the kitchen, sipping my coffee, I glanced around the room and something caught my eye. The cup that I had used just moments before, my favorite, chipped on the rim, was gone. It had been sitting right there, next to the empty plate. I blinked. I hadn't moved it. I stood up quickly, my heart skipping a beat. I checked the countertop, the cupboards, even the floor beneath the table, but it was nowhere to be found. A sense of unease settled over me. The air seemed thicker now, the quiet more oppressive. This couldn't be happening. The day dragged on in a blur of confusion and frustration. I found myself retracing my steps, constantly questioning whether I was just misplacing things or if something, some force, was truly toying with me. But it wasn't just the cup. As the hours passed, I noticed other things missing: a photo from the mantel, a chair from the corner of the living room, even a book I had been reading last night. Each time I noticed something gone, I couldn't remember when I last saw it. Had it always been missing? Had I moved it and simply forgotten? I thought I was losing my mind. That evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, the air in the house grew colder. I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. I turned quickly, my gaze darting around every room, every corner, but there was nothing. No figure. No footsteps. Just the silence. Then, the doorbell rang. I froze. The sound of it was too sudden, too sharp against the silence. I hadn't been expecting anyone, and yet, there it was, echoing through the house. I stood there, staring at the door for a long moment, unable to move. Who could it be? I hesitated before finally walking toward the door. My hands were trembling as I reached for the knob, the same feeling of dread rising in my chest. When I pulled it open, I expected to find someone there, someone to explain the strange events, to tell me that everything was fine, that I was just overreacting. But there was no one. The porch was empty. I stepped out, the chill in the air biting at my skin, and looked around. No one in sight. No cars, no footsteps. Just the stillness of the night. I closed the door, feeling an overwhelming sense of unease wash over me. What was going on? Why was everything in the house so wrong? Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw something shift. It was just a flicker, a movement in the darkness, too quick for me to fully process. I turned toward it, but there was nothing. Just the empty yard, the quiet night. My breath hitched. I rushed back inside, locking the door behind me. I couldn't stay in this house. Not anymore. The thought consumed me. I needed to leave. I needed to get out, to escape whatever was happening here. But as I turned to leave the room, I stopped dead in my tracks. A figure stood in the hallway, just outside the living room. It was barely visible, a shadow against the dim light, but I could see it clearly enough. The outline of a person, too tall, too thin, standing still. It didn't move, didn't speak. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't stay here. Not now, not ever again. But as I took a step back, the figure's head tilted slightly, almost as if it was watching me, waiting. The silence was unbearable, thick with the weight of what I couldn't understand. I opened my mouth to speak, to demand to know who or what it was, but no words came out. My throat was dry, my body frozen in place. And then, the figure began to move. Slowly at first, taking a single step forward. The footsteps echoed in the quiet, but this time, they didn't retreat. The figure took another step, then another. And each time it did, I felt the world around me shift, like the house itself was shifting, bending, as though this figure was warping reality, warping the very foundation of the place I thought I knew. I backed away, my breath ragged, my heart pounding in my chest. It was closer now, far too close. I could see its face, dark, distorted, like a reflection in a cracked mirror. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything I could understand. It was everything I feared. And it was here to stay. I couldn't breathe. My mind was screaming at me to run, to escape, but my body refused to obey. The figure, or whatever it was, had closed the distance between us. It loomed in the hallway, its presence so overwhelming that the walls seemed to press in around me. My pulse was deafening in my ears. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure stopped. It stood there, motionless, its featureless face staring in my direction. The room seemed to darken further, as if the air itself was being sucked into the space around it. I could feel it watching me. Not just with its eyes, there were no eyes, but with something far more unsettling. A presence. A pressure that wrapped itself around my chest, squeezing tighter with every second that passed. The silence was suffocating, a thick fog that clouded my thoughts and slowed my breathing. What did it want? Why was it here? I was barely aware of the sound of my own breath, short and shallow, as I took another step backward. My mind screamed at me to move faster, but my legs felt heavy, as though the ground beneath me had turned to lead. The figure made no move to follow me, but I could feel its pull, an invisible tether that seemed to tie me to it. I couldn't look away. I couldn't stop staring at its inhuman shape, even though every instinct screamed at me to run. I turned my head sharply, looking for an escape, anything. My eyes landed on the front door. My escape. I was just a few feet away from it. I took a step, then another, and the figure didn't move. It didn't react at all. I was almost there. But then, out of nowhere, I heard it again, the footsteps. The same soft thud, as if someone were walking away from me, yet the sound grew louder with every step. I spun around in panic. The figure hadn't moved, but the sound, it was coming from behind me. Slowly, steadily, as if someone was pacing the same path I was about to take. I froze. It wasn't possible. There couldn't be someone else here. I turned back to face the door, trying to move again, but my legs felt like lead. I couldn't move. My mind screamed for me to act, to fight, to escape, but I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed with terror. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I could hear them now, each step clear and distinct. A soft, dragging rhythm, as if something was following me, getting nearer with every second. I couldn't see anyone, but I knew someone, or something, was there. The door. The door was my only chance. I took a shaky step forward, my hand reaching for the knob, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But just as my fingers brushed the cool metal, the footsteps stopped. It was so quiet that I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. The house seemed to hold its breath. And then, the door behind me slowly creaked open. I spun around, panic surging through me. But no one was there. The doorway stood wide open, the dark corridor beyond it stretching out like a black hole, waiting to consume me. My feet moved before my brain could process what was happening. I ran. I bolted down the hallway, past the rooms, past the empty chairs and the photos on the walls. The house seemed endless now, twisting, turning on itself, as though the layout was changing around me, distorting in real time. I didn't know where I was anymore. The footsteps were gone, but I could still hear them in my mind. That rhythmic thudding. The sound that had started it all. I reached the stairs and nearly tripped over my own feet, scrambling to climb them two at a time. Every step I took felt like I was climbing farther away from something that I couldn't see but knew was there. The upstairs hallway was dimly lit, the shadows stretching long across the floor. As I moved down the hall, my eyes darted over the familiar doors, each one feeling more distant than the last. But then I stopped. There, at the end of the hall, was one door that had always been there. It was the door to the room I had locked away, the room I had avoided for so long. I hadn't opened it in years. And now, it was ajar. The air in the hallway seemed to grow colder. My breath came out in a visible puff, and the faintest whisper of a voice reached my ears, so quiet, so soft, I wasn't sure if it was real. You shouldn't have come here. It wasn't a whisper in the wind. It wasn't a figment of my imagination. The voice was coming from the open door. I couldn't move. My feet were stuck, frozen in place. The room seemed to beckon me, as though it had been waiting for me all along. The silence stretched on. Then, the footsteps returned. Slow, deliberate. They sounded like they were coming from within that room. I was being drawn toward it, pulled by an invisible force, as if the house itself wanted me to enter. But I knew I couldn't. I turned to run, but the footsteps were getting closer. The dark shape of the figure, the thing, was just behind me now. I could feel it, even if I couldn't see it. I wasn't sure how long I had left, but I couldn't let it catch me. I had to escape. I don't remember exactly how I managed to move. My mind was consumed with terror, drowning in the chaos of my own thoughts, but my body somehow carried me through the hall. I could feel the cold air closing in, the sound of the figure's presence trailing closer. Every step I took felt heavier than the last, as though the house itself was fighting against me, trying to hold me in place. I turned sharply into the closest room, slamming the door behind me. It was my bedroom. The familiar sight of the bed, the dresser, the window, everything looked normal. Everything seemed ordinary. But the air in the room was thick, oppressive. Something wasn't right. The footsteps had stopped. The sound that had haunted me for so long, the sound that had come closer and closer, was gone. I let out a shaky breath, unsure whether to feel relief or dread. I was alone, at least, that's what I told myself. But deep down, I knew better. Something had been following me. And it wasn't over. I backed away from the door, my eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement, any change. But the silence was deafening. The shadows in the corners seemed to grow longer, more oppressive. It felt as though they were reaching out, stretching toward me. I turned to face the window, hoping the daylight would bring some clarity, some sense of escape. But as I walked closer to the window, my heart skipped a beat. Outside, the sky was dark. Not the familiar dusk or twilight of evening, but an unnatural, deep blackness that seemed to stretch on forever. It wasn't night. The sky itself had changed. It was as though the day had been swallowed by some otherworldly force, leaving nothing but emptiness in its wake. I couldn't tear my eyes away. The room around me felt distant now, as though I were standing on the edge of some great chasm. My thoughts scrambled, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. That's when I heard it. A soft, familiar sound just like before. The footsteps, growing louder, closer. I turned, my chest tightening as I realized it was coming from inside the room now. I spun around, panic rising like a wave in my chest. But there was no one there. The room was empty. Nothing had changed. Except for one thing. The door to the hallway had opened. Just a crack, but enough to make my blood run cold. I hadn't opened it. My mind screamed at me to stay put, to lock the door and never move. But my feet betrayed me. They moved toward the door before I could even think. Every fiber of my being told me to run, but I felt an inexplicable pull to step closer. With each step, the sound of the footsteps grew louder, but now it wasn't the sound of someone walking toward me. No, it was the sound of someone walking away. Moving away from the door. Retreating. I stood frozen at the threshold, staring down the dark hallway, knowing that whatever was out there was waiting for me. Then, a faint whisper echoed from the hallway. Too soft to understand, but unmistakable. It felt like it was coming from inside my own head. You're not alone. I staggered back into the room, my heart pounding in my chest. I needed to leave. I needed to escape, to get out of this house, away from whatever was playing with me, tormenting me. But as I turned toward the window again, something caught my eye. The reflection in the glass wasn't mine. It was a figure. Tall, distorted, standing behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the door, still ajar, and the oppressive darkness beyond it. The footsteps had stopped. But I knew they weren't gone. And then, just as I was about to reach for the door, the lights flickered once more. The entire room seemed to tremble, like the very foundation of the house was shifting. I could feel it closing in, the walls pushing inward, the space growing tighter, smaller. The air grew colder, the darkness more suffocating. The figure had returned. It stood in the doorway, watching me. Watching, waiting. The air was thick with dread. I knew, deep down, that I couldn't escape it. Not anymore. And as the footsteps began again, fading further away, I understood. It wasn't just the house that was changing, it was me. The more I tried to run, the more it slipped away, like sand through my fingers. I was becoming part of this place. Part of the darkness. And there was no way out. No way to stop the steps from retreating, just as I had been. And with that thought, the house seemed to swallow me whole. Have you ever looked out of a window and seen something you couldn't explain? Something that didn't belong? A shadow, moving in ways that weren't quite right, but disappearing just as quickly as you noticed it? It started small. A flicker in the corner of my eye. I'd brush it off, dismissing it as a trick of the light or my tired eyes. After all, living in a high-rise in New York City meant I was constantly surrounded by strange reflections, the endless motion of people, cars, and shadows playing off the windows. but it wasn't like that. No, this felt different. I first noticed it one cold autumn evening. The city lights glittered like stars outside my apartment, and I was sitting in my living room, wrapped in a blanket, reading a book. The hum of the city below, the clatter of cars and voices, was a constant in my life now. I was used to it. Then, in the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shape. At first, I thought it was my reflection, the glow of a car passing by catching the glass just right. But no, it was more than that. It was a shadow, stretching across the glass, long and thin. It didn't belong. The rest of the window was lit, the city lights creating a kaleidoscope of colors, but that shadow, it was dark. Too dark. It seemed to move just slightly, as if it were breathing. I froze, heart racing, waiting for it to pass. But the shadow remained, growing darker, as though it were getting closer. I stood up, slowly, and moved toward the window, trying to see what it was. But when I got closer, there was nothing. Nothing but the city below and the distant hum of the world outside. I thought I was losing my mind. That night, I locked the door to my apartment, checked every window, every corner, and tried to convince myself I was just tired. But even as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching. The next few nights, the shadow returned. Every night. At first, it was subtle, a brief flicker that would vanish when I looked directly at it. But over time, it began to linger. The figure, if that's what it was standing still now, pressed up against the glass. And it was always there, every night, at exactly the same time. I began to feel its presence even when I wasn't looking out the window. It was like a constant pressure in the back of my mind, a weight that hung over me. Sometimes, I would hear a faint scratching sound, a tapping against the glass, as if something or someone was trying to get in. It was faint at first, but soon it became a familiar, chilling rhythm that I couldn't ignore. I started avoiding the window, pulling the curtains tight, hoping that would make it stop. But no matter how hard I tried to shut it out, the shadow was there, waiting for me. And with each night, it seemed to grow closer, more defined. Was it a ghost? A spirit? Or something else, something far worse? I couldn't tell anymore. The fear, the dread, were consuming me. I was losing sleep, my mind racing with possibilities. I had to know what it was. One night, the shadow was different. It didn't move, didn't shift. It was just there. Standing still, dark and unwavering. I had to know what it wanted. I forced myself to stand up, my legs trembling beneath me, and made my way to the window. Slowly, I pulled back the curtain, my breath catching in my throat. It was there. But this time, there was no mistaking it. The shadow had a shape now. A human shape. Tall, thin, and dressed in dark clothes, but I could see no details. No face, no features. Just a figure, standing motionless on the other side of the glass. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, unable to look away. It wasn't just outside the window anymore. It was standing directly against the glass, as if it could see me, waiting for me to make a move. And then, in a flash, it was gone. I slammed the curtain shut, my breath coming in ragged gasps. What the hell was happening? For the first time, I wondered if it was real. Was it a reflection? A trick of the light? Or was there something out there? Something that was watching me, waiting for me to open the door, to step into the unknown. But no matter how many times I checked the window, no matter how many times I convinced myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, the shadow always returned. I couldn't escape it. And I knew, deep down, that the shadow wasn't the only thing that was growing closer. I was starting to lose track of time, my mind unraveling as I waited for the next night to fall. I couldn't sleep that night. My body was exhausted, but my mind was racing, turning over everything that had happened. What did I see? Was it a trick? The shadow, the figure. Was it real, or had I imagined it? I tried to convince myself it was just the city. After all, I lived in one of the busiest places in the world. The noise, the reflections, the lights, they all play tricks on you, right? But deep down, I knew something was wrong. There was no way that shadow was just a mistake. The next evening, the fear started creeping back in, like a slow fog settling in my mind. I had stayed inside all day, avoiding the windows. I didn't want to look. I couldn't look. The apartment felt smaller, as if the walls were closing in around me. The moment the sun set and darkness swallowed the city, my stomach tightened. The sound of distant traffic below felt muted now, as if the world outside had slowed down. I found myself staring at the window, the same window where the shadow had appeared just the night before. It was almost like it was calling to me, daring me to acknowledge it. I sat on the couch, the curtains pulled tight, and stared at the empty space where the figure had been. I kept telling myself it would be okay. It was just a shadow. I couldn't let it control me. I had to be stronger than that. But the longer I sat there, the more it felt like the shadow was waiting for me. As if it knew I was trying to pretend it wasn't there. I got up, determined to shake off the creeping sense of dread. I moved around the apartment, trying to distract myself, making sure everything was locked, making sure nothing was out of place. But the air felt different tonight, heavy, thick. Every little sound seemed to echo louder than it should. The faint hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the old wooden floorboards beneath my feet, it all felt off, out of sync. At one point, I walked into the kitchen to grab a glass of water, and when I turned around to go back to the living room, I thought I heard something, footsteps, soft but clear. But when I looked, there was nothing there. I stood still, listening, the silence pressing down on me like a weight. I shook it off and returned to the couch. The clock ticked loudly in the quiet room, each second feeling like an eternity. I don't know how much time passed, but suddenly, I heard it again. The footsteps. This time, they were closer. I stood up immediately, straining to listen. My heart raced, my hands trembling. The footsteps came from the hallway outside my apartment, slow, deliberate, like someone was walking toward my door. My pulse quickened. I crept to the door, my breath caught in my throat. I couldn't open it. What if it was someone, or something? The steps stopped. I waited, holding my breath. The silence felt unbearable. It stretched on and on until the tension in the air was almost suffocating. Then, they began again. The steps were still distant, but now they sounded different. They didn't sound like someone walking toward me anymore. They sounded like someone was walking away. I froze, my body tense. It didn't make sense. Why would they stop at my door and then walk away? I waited for a long while, my mind trying to make sense of it. I couldn't. Then I heard something even stranger. The scraping sound. A faint, dry scrape across the floorboards just outside my door. It was subtle at first, like something shifting, but then it grew louder, more deliberate. I could almost feel it through the door, a strange vibration in the air. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but my voice wouldn't come. I backed away from the door, my mind spinning with terror. Was it a person? Or was it something else, something I didn't understand? I moved to the window, knowing what I would find but needing to confirm it. I had to see it, to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind. Slowly, I pulled the curtain back, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The city lights stretched out before me, a sea of neon signs and distant cars, but in the corner of the glass, there it was again. The shadow. It was still there, like it had been the night before. But this time, it was bigger. It wasn't just standing anymore, it was moving. Slowly, deliberately, as if it was pacing back and forth, waiting for me to make the next move. I couldn't breathe. My mind screamed at me to close the curtain, to run, to do anything. But I couldn't look away. The shadow was closer now, its shape clearer than before. A figure, tall and gaunt, its features lost in the darkness. I felt the eyes of that shadow on me, though I couldn't see them. But somehow, I knew they were there. And then, in a heartbeat, the shadow stopped moving. It was standing perfectly still, directly in front of the glass. Right in front of me. I wanted to scream, to run, to hide. But I couldn't move. I was paralyzed. The figure in the shadow seemed to shift. I thought it was going to disappear, like it had the night before. But instead, the figure bent forward, as if pressing its face closer to the window. And for the first time, I thought I saw it. A face. Not fully formed, but there, twisted and barely recognizable, like a nightmare that hadn't fully taken shape. The breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled backward, almost tripping over my own feet. I shut the curtains with shaking hands, my body trembling with fear. But even as I closed the window off from the darkness outside, I felt the eyes, those eyes, still watching me. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. And as the city buzzed on outside, I realized something terrifying. The shadow wasn't just out there anymore. It had found its way inside. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it had all been a product of my imagination. The shadows, the footsteps, the strange scraping sound, they were just the result of an overactive mind. The anxiety of living alone in the heart of a bustling city had likely played tricks on me. I told myself I was being ridiculous. But the look on the shadow's face lingered, and I couldn't shake it. I spent the day trying to keep busy, distracting myself with work, but every time I passed the window, my heart would skip a beat. The memory of the figure pressing its face against the glass haunted me, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder every few minutes as if I were being watched. I had to know if it was still there. By the time the sun began to set, the dread had returned, a familiar weight settling in my chest. I could feel the room growing smaller again. The apartment felt colder, even though I hadn't touched the thermostat. The same thick air that had clung to me last night now enveloped me once more. I couldn't stop myself from going to the window. I was drawn to it, despite the terror that pulsed through my veins. The city below was alive, just as it always was, but tonight there was something different about it. The lights, the movement, they all felt distant, muted. I felt isolated, as if the world outside had ceased to matter. I pulled back the curtain slowly, bracing myself for what I might see. And there it was. At first, I didn't know what I was looking at. It was just a shape, like a blur against the glass, shifting and moving like a mirage. But then it solidified, became clearer. The shadow. The same shadow I had seen the night before, only this time it was closer, much closer than before. I backed away, my heart racing. It was impossible. I had closed the curtains. There was no way it could be back. But there it was, standing in the same spot as last night. A tall, indistinct figure, its outline barely visible in the dim light of the city. But something about it was different. It felt wrong. The figure shifted again, just like the night before, pacing slowly, deliberately. It wasn't just standing there anymore. It was moving, and its movements were so precise, so calculated. I felt like I was being observed, studied. The figure knew I was watching. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't normal. I slammed the curtain shut, my pulse pounding in my ears. The air was thick with fear as I turned away from the window, but the oppressive weight in the room remained. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that I wasn't alone, even though there was no one there. It was in that moment that I realized I hadn't heard the footsteps anymore. The silence was deafening. The sound of the city had disappeared, leaving nothing but the cold echo of my own breath. I slowly turned my head, my eyes darting to the door. It was still locked. But I had the distinct sensation that someone, something, was waiting for me just beyond it. I walked cautiously toward the door, my heart hammering in my chest. Every instinct in me screamed to run, to leave, to get as far away from this apartment as possible. But I couldn't move. I couldn't escape the suffocating grip of fear that held me in place. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. I stopped, my fingers hovering just above the metal. A cold sweat broke out across my skin. Was it out there? The thought lingered, stuck in my mind like a mantra. It didn't make sense. The shadow, the footsteps, the scraping sounds. It was all too much. Too real. Too tangible. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, and opened the door. The hallway outside was quiet. Empty. No footsteps. No sounds at all, save for the faint hum of the building's old plumbing. I exhaled, half relieved, half terrified. I didn't know what I had been expecting, but the emptiness felt almost worse than anything I could have imagined. And then I heard it. A knock. It was so soft at first, I almost convinced myself I hadn't heard it. But then it came again, louder, sharper this time. 3 distinct knocks. My pulse quickened, and I froze, staring at the door. I knew I shouldn't open it. I knew I should call someone, get help, but the same fear that had paralyzed me the night before gripped me again. I couldn't escape. I couldn't let go. Another knock. Louder this time. I reached for the door, my body shaking uncontrollably. The knob was cold in my hand as I slowly twisted it, the wood groaning under my touch. I opened it. No one was there. Just the empty hallway, stretching out in front of me, as silent and still as ever. But then I saw it. At the far end of the hall, just before the stairs, there was a shadow. It was dark, indistinct, and it was moving. Moving toward me. I slammed the door shut. My breath was coming in short gasps now. I backed away from the door, my mind spinning. What was going on? Why was this happening? I couldn't think straight. The figure in the hallway, the shadow outside my window. I realized, with growing horror, that they weren't two separate things. They were the same. and it was getting closer. I didn't know how much longer I could hold onto my sanity. The figure was here, and it was coming for me. The hallway outside my door was still, impossibly still. I stood there, frozen in place, with my hand on the doorknob, staring at the faint sliver of light escaping from beneath the door. The knocking had stopped. The sounds of footsteps? Gone. But the presence? It was suffocating. I tried to breathe. Tried to tell myself that maybe this was all just a twisted dream, that if I could just sleep, everything would be fine. But deep down, I knew better. I felt it in my bones. The presence was too real. Too undeniable. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me, something or someone just beyond that door. Slowly, I backed away from the door, my mind spinning. What should I do? Call the police? Tell someone? But who would believe me? Who would understand that something beyond human comprehension was happening to me? And then, the thought hit me like a punch to the gut. What if I was the one who was changing? What if all of this was in my mind? What if I was losing my grip on reality? I shook my head, trying to rid myself of the thought, but it lingered like a shadow, growing darker the more I resisted. I didn't know who I was anymore, what was real, and what was a product of my fear. There was only one thing I knew for certain. I couldn't stay in that apartment anymore. The walls were closing in. The air, thick with dread, was unbearable. I had to leave, now, before whatever was lurking in the dark could find me. I turned toward the window, a sense of urgency overtaking me. The figure had been there again, outside, in the shadows. Watching. Waiting. I grabbed my coat from the chair and rushed toward the door, but before I could reach it, I heard it. A sound. Soft. Deliberate. Steps. It wasn't coming from the hallway this time. It was coming from inside the apartment. I spun around, my heart hammering against my ribcage. My eyes darted to every corner of the room, every shadow. Nothing. I took a step forward. Another. And then, the whispering. Low, barely audible, like a soft breeze against my ear. You can't escape. I froze. My mind screamed for me to run, to escape, but my feet were glued to the floor. I turned toward the window again. The figure was gone, but I couldn't shake the sense that it had never left, that it was always here, watching, waiting. The whisper came again, louder this time. You belong here. I stumbled backward, my chest tight with terror. I didn't know what was real anymore. What was I hearing? What was I seeing? I reached for my phone, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I needed to call someone, anyone, but the screen remained dark. The battery had died. The room felt colder now. The air heavier, suffocating. The walls seemed to close in around me, and the shadows, those shifting, oppressive shapes, grew longer, deeper. And then I saw it. A figure. It was standing in the doorway. A tall, indistinct shadow, its edges blurring into the dark corners of the room. It didn't move, didn't speak. But it was there. Watching. I tried to scream, but my voice wouldn't come. My throat was tight, constricted with fear. It was too much. I couldn't handle it anymore. I bolted for the door, fumbling with the knob, but it wouldn't turn. It was locked. Locked. I yanked at the handle, desperately trying to open it, but the door was stuck. The figure in the doorway stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, until it was just inches away. I could feel its presence now, pressing down on me. It was inside my mind, inside my body, crawling beneath my skin. The whispers grew louder. You can't leave. You're mine now. I finally managed to wrench the door open, stumbling into the hallway. But the hallway was no longer the one I knew. The lights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. The once familiar space was now foreign, unrecognizable. The walls seemed to close in on me, narrowing until I could barely move. I turned around, but the door had disappeared. There was no escape. The hallway stretched on endlessly, twisting, turning, pulling me deeper into its dark, suffocating embrace. And then, from the darkness, I heard the sound again. The footsteps. Closer. Closer. Always closer. I ran. I don't know how long, how far, but I ran, my breath ragged, my heart pounding. I felt as though I was being chased by something I couldn't outrun, something that was always just behind me, closing in with every step. But the footsteps never stopped. And I realized, in that moment of desperate clarity, it wasn't just the shadow in the window. It was the shadow of me. The fear I had been running from was never an external force. It was something inside me. A part of me that I had been ignoring, hiding from all this time. And now it had caught up. There was no escaping it. There never had been. And in the cold, suffocating silence of that endless hallway, I realized with growing dread, I was already gone. I don't know how much time passed. Moments, hours, maybe even days. The hallway stretched on like an eternal loop, bending and twisting in ways that defied logic. The light overhead flickered sporadically, casting unsettling shadows that seemed to move while I wasn't looking. Every corner I turned led to another impossibly long stretch of darkness, and the footsteps, those relentless, agonizing footsteps, never stopped. I was exhausted. My legs felt like they were made of lead, my throat raw from screaming, my mind unraveling with each passing second. I tried to scream again, but my voice was gone, swallowed by the oppressive silence that now engulfed me. The footsteps were still there, just behind me, their rhythm a slow, mocking echo of my own desperation. It was as though the world had shifted, leaving me in a place that didn't make sense, a place that shouldn't exist. The apartment, the streets, everything that I once knew, gone, erased. Now, it was just me in the darkness, with the sound of my own breath the only thing keeping me grounded, even though it too felt unnatural, foreign. I stumbled forward, my fingers scraping against the walls for any sign of direction, of hope. But the walls were slick with moisture, the surface pulsing under my touch, as if the building itself was alive, breathing, watching. Is this it? I thought, but the thought was a fleeting one, replaced by an overwhelming dread that seized my chest. What had I done to deserve this? What had I done to bring this thing into my life? The footsteps came closer, louder. I was no longer running. I had nothing left. My legs didn't obey me anymore. I could feel the weight of the darkness pushing down on me, suffocating me, crushing me under its weight. I turned again, hoping for some kind of escape, but there was nothing. No doors. No windows. Just the endless stretch of hallway, with shadows that reached out like hands, trying to pull me back. It was then that I saw it. At the very end of the hallway, there was a door. A door I hadn't noticed before. A door that hadn't been there a moment ago. It was old, withered, the wood warped and cracked, the edges jagged as though it had been forced open countless times. There was no light beyond it, no indication of what waited behind it. But it was there. I took a step toward it, my heart hammering. Was this the end? Was this my chance to escape? The footsteps were closer now, so close that I could almost feel the presence behind me. I dared not look. I couldn't. If I turned around, if I saw what was following me, I knew I would lose myself completely. I reached the door. The handle was cold to the touch, sending a jolt of electricity through my veins. I didn't hesitate. I yanked it open, and there was nothing. Just empty space. I fell forward, crashing into nothingness. My body tumbled, spinning wildly, the darkness swallowing me whole. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a sound, a soft, eerie whisper, so faint that it could have been a breeze. "You'll never be free." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. There was no air in the void, no ground beneath my feet. I was falling into an abyss of nothingness, where time had no meaning, where reality itself began to dissolve. And then, just as I thought I couldn't go any deeper, the darkness shifted. It swirled around me, taking shape. I saw the shadow. It was standing in front of me, its tall, distorted form looming just out of reach, the edges flickering like a candle in the wind. The same figure I had seen so many times, watching me from the window, in the hallway, from behind every corner. "You can't run from yourself," it whispered again, its voice coming from all directions at once. "You're mine now." I reached out, desperate to escape, but my hand passed right through it, as if the shadow were made of smoke, intangible, slipping away the moment I tried to grasp it. And then, just like that, it was gone. The presence, the footsteps, the darkness, it all vanished. I was left alone in the void. I don't know how long I floated in that empty space. Minutes? Hours? An eternity? Time had lost all meaning, and with it, the sense of self. I was no longer sure who I was, what was real, or if anything had ever been real. And then, slowly, the world began to take shape again. At first, it was faint, like a distant memory. Colors bled back into existence, soft at first, then growing sharper, more defined. The walls, the windows, the floors, all began to return. But something was wrong. The apartment wasn't the same. The furniture was gone, the walls bare. There was a sense of emptiness, as though the life had been drained from the place. And then I saw the window. The same window where I had first noticed the shadow. But this time, the shadow was gone. The window was empty. And I realized with a shiver that I wasn't alone. Not anymore. I was no longer the woman who had walked into that apartment. I was something else, something darker, something hollow. The shadow was a part of me now, and it would never leave. It never had. This has been a long, dark journey through the night with Whisper Crowley. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Leave a like if these stories made you look at the darkness a little differently, and share in the comments what you enjoyed most or what gave you chills. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next Sinister Whispers. Until we meet again in the world of shadows.